started in less than 1 minute, so I just wanted to get That's wonderful. It is exactly 12:15, so I will call this meeting to order, first by welcoming everyone who is joining us today for the Tennessee State Board of Education's first quarterly workshop meeting of 2023. I'm going to ask Casey Griffin to call the roll to establish a quorum.
Yes.
As soon as he's ready.
Mr. Collins. Mr. Darnell.
Here.
Mr. Eby.
Here.
Mr. Holt.
Here.
Mr. Smith. Mr. Jensen.
Here.
Mr. Mullenhour.
Here.
Mr. Morrow.
Here.
Mr. Wells. Madam Chairman?
Here.
Madam Chairman, I count 7 members present.
Thank you. I declare that we have a quorum and we are duly convened. Pursuant to Section 8 of Policy 1.400, the Board's meeting policy, workshops are meetings of the State Board sitting as a committee of the whole. In accordance with this policy and the law, I declare that we are in the committee of the whole for the purposes of conducting this workshop. Before we move into the official agenda, I do want to take a few minutes to recognize some very special people who are here with us today. The Department of Education's Teacher Advisory Council members who are joining us today, and they are comprised of from 18 to 22 exceptional educators from across the state, representing a diverse range of grade levels, subject areas, and experience. They are identified from educator recognition programs, including Teacher of the Year. For example, Mrs. Morgan Rankin from the previous year is here with us. She was the recipient of that award in 2021-22. And our current Teacher of the Year, Dr. Melissa Collins. They serve for 2 years as leaders, ambassadors, advisors, and champions. They meet monthly to discuss the broader web of education. They provide feedback on department initiatives, policies, and resources. So I'm going to ask that the Teacher Advisory Council please stand to be recognized. I'll just say a blanket thank you so much for being here, and thank you for what you do day in and day out, and in particularly because you are exceptional teachers and the recognition and rewards that you have received. Congratulations to you. We do look forward to meeting with you after our workshop presentations, so stay tuned. Thank you. Now we'll move into the presentations, and I do want to issue the usual reminders to all of our presenters to please state your name and title for the record. We will start with additional endorsement pathways. Ms. Megan McElroy and I believe Ms. Deborah Knoll will be joining you. They're from the Department of Education.
Am I on now? Hello. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Vice Chair Eby, members of the board. Thank you for having us today. My name is Megan McElroy. I'm the Chief of Statewide Supports at the Tennessee Department of Education. Today, I'm going to be providing you with updates on the additional endorsement programs we've been running at the department in special ed and ESL. And I will sort of set that up then for my colleague Deb Knoll to talk about where we're heading with our computer science endorsement. Let me get this clicker to work. There we go. You all are very well versed in our strategic priorities and see this slide all the time. But I'm here to talk to you today about our educators' priority, and our additional endorsements have been a key strategy of that priority to expand access and opportunities for educators to advance in their career and develop and expand their skills at no cost to the educator. So let's talk about our SPED and ESL endorsements. The quick reminder on where these endorsements, how this came about. The primary focus of our discussion today will be the TDOE sponsored endorsements that the board approved in July of 2021 as a pathway to earning an endorsement as outlined in Educator Licensure Policy 5.502. However, I'll also share a little bit about the ESL and SPED endorsements that we have funded through educator preparation providers as well, both to highlight outcomes of that program in a comprehensive way and provide that full picture of options that are available to our educators today. So just by way of a quick reminder of that policy, it authorizes the department to issue additional endorsements to educators holding a valid professional license in the areas that are listed in tiny font on the bottom of this slide: ESL Pre-K-12, SPED Intervention K-8, SPED Intervention 6-12, and SPED Comprehensive K-12. Candidates who enroll in the program with us at the department must complete all of the coursework that we provide to them and receive qualifying scores on the assessments that are outlined in the board's professional assessments policy 5.105. We are required as such then to align our program content to those appropriate specialty area program standards as well as all EPPs do in their endorsement programs. We are also, as part of this policy, required to annually publish our candidate passage rates on those required assessments on our website, as well as the demographic information about program completers, including race, ethnicity, and geographic data. The discussion we'll have here today is kind of our first presentation to the board on these annual outcomes, and we will move forward with posting that required information on our website following the presentation today, but wanted to have a chance to talk with you all first before doing that. And I should have said at the beginning, please ask questions throughout. I'm very comfortable with you all interrupting me if there's something I am not being clear about or you have a question about. So that's just kind of the policy context. Let's talk about how we actually implemented these programs over the past year. As we began to plan for offering these endorsements, we made a very intentional decision to start small. It felt really important to us to learn what it takes to actually get this right at a small scale before expanding our offerings to ensure that we're able to provide the best possible programs to students and educators and set them up for success. The last thing we would want is to get them in a program and learn a bunch of lessons and realize we hadn't set them up for success. So that being said, we started both relatively small in terms of our cohort size, as well as narrowing the endorsements that we offered. So you'll recall I listed those 4 that were authorized to offer in state board policy. We chose to focus in on 2 based on our data that are the most in demand at the current moment and start there. So those you can see on the screen are our special ed interventionist K-8 endorsement and our English as a second language pre-K-12. We offered about 30 seats in each program, and you can see where we kind of shook out in terms of enrollment, 29 in our SPED program and 32 in our ESL. We had 2 people on our professional learning team at the department who each were facilitating one of these endorsements in addition to their other work. And each endorsement program was comprised of 8 asynchronous modules that were run through the department's online learning management system, our LMS. Some of the material was delivered through videos, some delivered through readings, and participants then completed assignments based on their learnings in that coursework and submitted it to our staff members. And then the staff scored and returned work back to students with feedback and their scores. Our team also ran optional office hours, so made themselves available, much like professors would do, for students to come and ask questions and get additional support. And they ran some additional praxis prep sessions for candidates as well to make sure they felt prepared for that assessment upon completion of coursework. We did work with 2 independent contractors who helped us develop the content of the modules for these endorsement paths. So we set up an enrollment system in order to align with the key goals of these programs that are outlined in policy. First, closing gaps in educator vacancies in hard to fill areas, making programs accessible to people where it may not otherwise be accessible, and serving a geographically and racially diverse group of educators. So you can see how these goals kind of played out and how we set up our selection process on this slide, as people earned more points if they said they planned to teach in one of these roles. So trying to get at filling those vacancies, if they were from a rural district, if their district had reported vacancies to us in those areas. So we tried to align the way in which we selected candidates to meet the objectives of the program. We ended up accepting all of our eligible SPED applications. However, we had more ESL applicants than we could support. We received just over 200 applications for our ESL programs. So we had to have a bit more of a competitive selection process for ESL, and we considered additional points if they had a very strong student focus and sort of their narrative and rationale for wanting to earn the endorsement. This trend, I will say, is consistent with what we're seeing across all of our endorsement offerings. There is an increasing demand for ESL endorsements and a decreasing demand for our SPED endorsements. And when we talk about some of the lessons learned, I will come back to share some thoughts on that. But that was how we set up our enrollment process. Okay, on this slide, you can see our candidate coursework completion rates and our passage rates on the specialty area content assessments that are required in policy. So just to orient you here quickly, the yellow bar represents our SPED endorsement cohort, and the blue bar represents our ESL endorsement cohort. So of the 29 people who enrolled in our SPED intervention cohort, we had 23 successfully complete the coursework. So that's about a 79% completion rate for our SPED endorsement. Of those 23 who completed coursework, what you're then seeing as you move to the right in those bars, the yellow ones again are the SPED that I'm talking about now. 19 of those took the praxis, and all 19 of them passed. So we had a 100% pass rate on candidates who followed through and took the praxis exam. Yep, Mr. Mora.
Thank you, Nate Morrow. Just for the ones that didn't successfully complete the coursework, did you find out why? Like, was there a common theme or common factors for those who were not able to complete the coursework?
Yeah, so we did a survey actually, because you'll see as we move to ESL, our ESL completion rates were significantly lower than our SPED. And we did a survey, and the three most common reasons were just the workload and the amount of reading and writing that they had to do. And I have, in the lessons learned, certainly we can talk about it now, some reflections on the difference in the SPED and ESL coursework and how that might have impacted what we saw. But so just the amount of workload, and keep in mind it's free, so there's not a lot of skin in the game, or no skin in the game, for an educator who very understandably gets overwhelmed with, the work of the school year and decides that they're not able to continue to take this on. Second, the phrasing we saw was like committed to too many things. So people similarly acknowledged they overcommitted themselves. And then we also saw some medical issues. We had, a smaller number, but some COVID was a factor, and just other related medical issues that caused people to have to pause.
Similarly, if the person went ahead and completed the course, why would they not gone ahead and taken the praxis?
That is a good question, and one I don't have a real answer for. It's possible that some, complete the coursework and, sort of speculating, but okay, I'll take that later. I'm busy right now. I'll do that. I'll get to that. I'll take the test later. The assessments were paid for, so there wasn't, a cost factor there. But I think it's probably just actually making that happen, or maybe they don't have a role in their school district right now for them to move into a SPED role, and so there wasn't an urgent need. You would imagine reasons like that, but we didn't.
But wouldn't you want to take the practice as soon as you could after completing?
I would.
Yeah.
I made that mistake in college a few times, trying to come back to an exam later. It didn't go well. So let's look at the blue bars on here. Those are our ESL rates. We talked about the SPED. Of the 32 people enrolled in our ESL cohort, we had 19 successfully complete coursework. That is about a 59% completion rate on those. Of those 19, 17 took the praxis and 16 of them passed. So we continued to see strong passage rates on the praxis, which gives us confidence in the content and the coursework that we had. The issues we were seeing are more about the completion and following through on those requirements. Initial thinking on the difference between these two programs. We could talk more about it at the end when I get to our lessons learned, but we think it's a result of differences in the SPED and ESL coursework. The ESL coursework overall was significantly more reading than the SPED coursework. It was very dense higher ed textbook chapter reading, 5 or 6 chapters per module, and then they take an assessment at the end. Whereas our SPED programs were more designed like you would think of like a TDOE training, right? If you PowerPoints, videos, interactive, shorter assignments throughout. And our hypothesis is that design of the coursework and some of the feedback we heard to Mr. Moore's question in the survey was that the ESL content was much heavier and much more challenging for folks to get through. So when we get to lessons learned, we can kind of talk about how we're thinking about that, given that both led to outcomes, in terms of praxis pass rates, but how we want to consider those moving forward. So on this slide, what I wanted to do is put the pass rates for our TDOE endorsements in context of the passage rates for praxis that we're seeing in additional endorsement programs that we are funding free to candidates also through other EPP programs. As a quick refresher on those EPP funded programs, we began granting funds to EPPs in the 2021 school year to offer additional endorsements in SPED across all of the SPED endorsement areas previously noted. In that first year, we offered almost 200 spots for SPED endorsements through EPPs. The next school year, that would be 2021-22, we continued those grant endorsements, but also added ESL and secondary math. We had 2,000 SPED seats that year, 800 ESL and 150 math. And then in this school year, the 2022-23 school year, we're currently offering an additional 1,800 SPED seats and 600 ESL seats. So what you're seeing on this slide is the data for our 21-22. Last year, we don't have our data yet. Obviously for this year, those programs are ongoing, but you're seeing the data funded through EPPs, which is the blue bar, alongside our TDOE run endorsements, which is a yellow bar. So this is just to give you a comparison that we are seeing generally on par, if not exceeding, the outcomes that we're getting through our EPP programs as well.
On this particular chart, you have in the far right column 100% 19 test takers. And you don't have the legend on the left-hand side to indicate what level of percentage it should be. But when you look at the other three, they're so much smaller in comparison. And it doesn't look like it's in proper...
It's not scaled well.
Scaled.
Yes, you're correct.
Scaled, okay.
Yep, that is a great flag. I appreciate that. It is not scaled well. Those numbers are much closer than they appear
Right,
visually.
exactly.
Thank you for flagging that.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yep.
Right.
This slide just further breaks down for if you're in.
One
Oh,
question.
sorry. Yes.
I'm sorry. If I heard you correct, you said like there was 2,000 seats or 1,800 seats. But I'm looking at, even if you add the EPPs and the TDOEs, you're talking about 300 or 400 or something like that. What's the difference between the...
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So yes, I did cite thousands of seats for those SPED endorsements. You're seeing hundreds who actually took the praxis. Our only hypothesis on that is it's literally the same issue that we saw, folks not actually completing, and those numbers, because of the larger scale, are much more dramatic in our EPP run programs. We have not had particularly high completion rates for coursework in our EPP run programs, and you're seeing a much smaller number as a result who are actually going through and taking the praxis. And again, our hypothesis is this is a free program, and we haven't seen great attrition in terms of completing coursework.
Yeah, I mean, that's only like 20% or something like that are enter it and are completing it. So if I were an EPP, I'd want to understand what's going on there, because somebody's using resources to teach those classes, right?
Yeah, we had, I would say, probably between a 60, or it varies among programs. We had between a 60% and a 98% completion rate. And then you're seeing an additional drop off of those folks who complete and then go, the folks who actually got licensed as a result range from 20 to 50% of overall enrolled candidates.
Dr.
Yep.
Morrison has a question. Oh, did you have a follow-up?
So of the seats, have you done an assessment of what the need is out there? And is the need comparable to the seats, or is the need more comparable to the completers?
Yeah, I think we have not done a full study yet. We have just finished collecting vacancy data for this year, so we are eager to go ahead and align where we're seeing vacancies now. It's possible that we've solved for a lot of the SPED vacancies that we were seeing previously, but we will need to dig into this year's data to assess that, and we will do that and be happy to kind of share that analysis back with you. It's also possible we've just kind of reached a saturation. We've had thousands and thousands of seats on educators who want to earn these endorsements. So given that we are seeing a significantly more demand in ESL, we have already started in our current contracts with EPPs, moving some of those SPED seats to ESL, because we do have more ESL candidates than we have seats for currently. So we're trying to balance it out based on what we're just seeing even in terms of demand from our current teaching workforce.
Yes, Dr. Morrison.
Building on that a little bit, I'm curious, how are you thinking about the cost for what you're funding at an EPP versus the cost of running it internal to TDOE? Because in a former life, sitting in a seat, like you're like thinking about the Teach Tennessee program and, what it costs to do that from the State Department versus what an EPP already has and is managing. I mean, when you're saying it's free for the EPP, are you funding some of the professor time, or is it just the praxis, or like how are the costs?
We are funding the full program for the EPP.
So like all the staff required to.
Correct.
So it might be more.
It's like
expensive.
a per seat cost, if you will, for them to provide that endorsement to that candidate.
You contracted with EPP to agree with what that was.
Yep.
Is it more expensive, like per candidate, to go the EPP route versus the TDU?
I don't know. I haven't done the math
Just in
on
terms
my
of the
two
cost
staff
analysis,
members
yeah.
versus. I will say we could never reach the scale internally that an EPP can, so
Yep.
that's a consideration as well. And I'll talk more about that when I get to the lessons learned too. Okay, the next set of slides I'll go through pretty quickly. They're all a similar format of these pie charts, and this is just to update you on the component around the diversity of the candidates who are in our programs. So what you're seeing here first is our ESL endorsement, and it shows the racial ethnic background of candidates. This data is, I will note, specifically for those who completed all of the programming. We decided just to focus on that group, though certainly we have the broader data set, and I'd be happy to provide it in follow-up. But so these are just that group who completed the coursework of our program. And there are, just a reminder, the N size on this is about 19. So you can see that we had a fairly representative sample of backgrounds for the educators who participated in our ESL endorsement. This is the geographic breakdown of those ESL endorsements. So because of the small numbers, we decided just to do a grand division look versus a regional look. But again, certainly we have as much of the background data as you would like us to provide in follow-up, but you can see kind of where folks were across the state who participated in these endorsements. So similar, this is our SPED endorsement. This is the demographic breakdown of folks enrolled and completing our SPED program. Slightly less diverse than our ESL program, but again, we accepted all the applicants who applied, so our pool was quite a bit different than for ESL. And then again, the SPED geographic breakdown. So of those who completed coursework, where did they come from across the state? We had a fairly good spread across our regions of the state. So I've been saying I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned through this first year of implementation, and then I'll talk about kind of where we are now and what we're thinking in the future. I think there are three big things I want to highlight here, some of which have already come up in our conversation. But first is the content design. We touched on that briefly in terms of the differences between our ESL, program completer number, and SBE. But just to reiterate, we engaged in a pretty thorough analysis of what content needed to be included in these programs based on the specialty area program standards and the praxis assessment requirements, and set clear expectations for those contractors to make sure that content was thoroughly covered. We did not set clear expectations for the method by which that content should be covered. For example, what is an appropriate amount of reading, writing, listening, open-ended questions, multiple choice questions, etc. So that's a lesson learned in really defining what that learning experience should look like, and something that we will take into the future. So as a result, of course, as I've said, we ended up with two pathways that were very different in design and the candidate experience. However, again, I'll just note we didn't see a difference in those two methods in terms of praxis pass rates. Both seem to work equally well, if you will, in terms of preparing candidates to demonstrate the knowledge. However, not being able to keep candidates, engaged in the coursework is a problem. And so I think, we have certainly learned that engagement and accessibility of the content is really important. Dr. Morrison, to your question, the demand of facilitation for us as an agency was also challenging, capacity-wise at the department. Facilitating this kind of learning is a pretty significant job, anywhere from 10 to 20 hours. So I could do the math and answer your question at some point. Worth of work per week went into ensuring the content was loaded into the LMS. Emails were answered, concerns were addressed, work was scored, feedback was given to candidates. It was a good amount of work, even just for 30 candidates. We also added synchronous praxis prep sessions to ensure that our participants felt supported in their preparation for the assessments, which was another human capital investment on our team. It is just transparently, I think, difficult to imagine how we could scale this as a TDOE agency-run endorsement to more than somewhere in the range of the size of the cohorts that we ran, 30 plus participants. Without changing our staffing structure, I will say that, right? Or hiring contractors, or we would have to do some adjustments to make that happen. And then finally, certainly attrition that we have talked about. We had high numbers of participants accept spots and then not complete the coursework or leave the program early on. That said, it was comparable to kind of what we saw across other EPP programs who are running these free endorsements. And as I said, we suspect it's kind of a symptom of this being a completely free opportunity. And we talked about this survey that we administered to try to get at outcomes.
Go ahead. Just one more quick question. Were you able to get any feedback from the candidates in terms of I know the praxis is one indication. You indicated some feedback on why they didn't complete, but in terms of preparedness and, the differences in the two models and the EPP run endorsements, just trying to gauge, how you think about moving forward, what's the best option for candidates?
I don't recall off the top of my head what else we asked on that survey, but I'd be happy to find out. And we still have, this is a small group of people that we still have access to, so I think certainly a great recommendation if we haven't, to really, understand and utilize that group to give us some robust feedback.
Just as we think about, what we're going to talk about next, it probably is good to dig in with them a little bit if we can.
Yep, absolutely. So in terms of what's happening this year, where we're going in the future, the department chose not to offer additional cohorts of the TDOE run endorsements in this current 22-23 school year. So we are not currently running an additional cohort beyond the one we've been talking about from last year. The reason for that being, as we talked about, we still have over 1,000 seats that are open through our EPP run programs through those TDOE grants. And given that the demand hasn't appeared to be there this year, we decided it doesn't make sense for us to then layer this on top and use our capacity to try to offer another round of programs. So we made that decision to try to funnel folks to our EPP seats while we have those available. And we continue to, those are allowed to enroll on an ongoing basis, so we continue to do recruitment and we've had a lot of conversations with districts trying to understand, and we'll continue to, like, why those might not be being filled. And I think it will be especially interesting to look at our current state of vacancy data alongside that.
So just to clarify, when do those grants run out? Because the list of the EPPs that were on the previous page, I forget I didn't count how many there are, 8 or 9 or so. That's grant funded, and that goes through,
This 2022-23 school year is the last year
This
of
is the
those
last
grants.
year.
We have, though, through our contract with the Grow Your Own Center out of the University of Tennessee, as part of our strategy to embed this into our Grow Your Own work long term, we included a much smaller number of seats in the Grow Your Own contract. So we will be able to continue to offer some through UT through that grant through 23-24, I want to say.
thank you. Yes.
I applaud the department for having this and providing this opportunity, and I think your conclusion, based on the data you have, makes a lot of sense. So, it was an opportunity, looked at it capacity-wise. You're moving forward away from that. Let me ask this one question. Does this department-offered option meet, or does it reach a cohort that is totally different than EPP? In other words, is there a reason to continue that because it gets to somebody that you wouldn't get through an EPP?
Well, I think that you're giving me a nice segue to my kind of what's coming next slide. But I don't have on me, and I don't know if we've actually run even just the demographic and geographic diversity of our EPP run endorsement. So I think that would be interesting to look at. Or is it tapping into a different population of educators or in different parts of the state? So that is something we will look at. I appreciate that flag. But I think to your point, what we are thinking, first of all, the outcomes from the programs for those who took and passed the praxis do give us confidence in our ability to execute small cohorts and do that well and ensure that educators are equipped to pass the required assessments to earn their license. What I'm thinking about in the very early stages of is how can we use a small cohort of a TDOE run endorsement to serve a very specific population. So we've thought about, could we offer this just to educators in our distressed counties? Could we offer it just to educators in our priority schools? So we're starting to kind of brainstorm around if we have this opportunity and we know we've done it well to serve 25 to 30 educators, how can we really prioritize our time in doing that and reach a group of educators who have particular need and really make this a value add to certain populations of our state? So that is something we're starting to think about as the EPP funded endorsements roll off and we think about kind of a long-term play on how we could use this. That's what we're starting to think about.
Continue. Now, I think I'll ask my question after your next.
That was I just wanted to say, as I close, I was going to tee up Deb and sort of explain how this connects to the computer science endorsement, so I can hold that until you're done with your questions.
You may have said this, but I don't recall seeing it when I reviewed the slides before or even this morning. Do we know of those who have passed praxis, whether it was for SPED or ESL, if any of them have moved from their current content area to teach SPED or ESL? From what they were doing before? Do you have that?
We do not know that. It's possible that we could survey them. We have, we know who these people are. It's difficult our current system in TN Compass doesn't allow us to track, that level of detail on employment, but we'd have to do some outreach to the candidates, but it's possible.
I'm not sure if anybody wants you to do that at this juncture, in particular because it's being placed on hold.
Yeah.
I would say if you were continuing it and it was growing, then it would be important to know how successful is it really in filling that gap where we have vacancies.
Yep. And we'll be able to do that not on a person by person level, but on a more global level as we dig into the current vacancy data that we just received, but not at that, individual level as you noted.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I think that would be really interesting to know because I know several teachers who are in one of these cohorts for ESL. In Hamlin County, that's a huge thing for us. But I think what tends to happen with those teachers are they want the endorsement for SPED or EL so they can be better classroom teachers, be more well-rounded instead of necessarily wanting to move into those spots.
That's
so
right.
I think that would be interesting to really see. if that's having an effect, or is it just, I want more skills to be able to
That's
reach
right.
more students?
Certainly, I 100% agree that while one of our goals was to address vacancies across the state, there is tremendous value for educators in a general education setting to have the knowledge and skills, because everybody works with these students. And so there's tremendous value in that alone, but I think still looking at that data sounds like it would be of interest.
Very good.
So as we close and transition to my colleague Deb Knoll to talk about computer science, I think we've taken some of the lessons that we've learned certainly into the design of that endorsement, including using a third party to support with the content development and facilitation from that capacity standpoint that I talked about, as well as both aligning the content with our specialty area program requirements and test requirements, and also ensuring that the design of the content is manageable for participants. So I wanted to kind of tee that up for Deb to come and talk to you about our computer science endorsement.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Deborah Knoll, Assistant Commissioner of CCTE. Thank you for having me, Madam Chair. I would like to take the next couple minutes just to talk through our new computer science endorsement pathway and what that means for our educators here in Tennessee. So we have a statewide need, obviously with the new mandated legislation. Chapter 979 of the Public Acts of 2022, now codified in Tennessee Code, relative to computer science education, expands computer science education in Tennessee, and it expands it all the way from K through 12. So starting in the 24-25 school year, all middle schools and high schools in Tennessee provide computer science courses, and computer science will also be integrated into elementary school content through the computer science standards that will go forward with final reading tomorrow for State Board. So middle schools will provide computer science courses for at least one grading period during the student's middle school career, and high schools will offer at least one high school credit of computer science. As we looked in this legislation, we noted that we would need about 1,000 computer science teachers needed to start that 24-25 school year. So we know as it quickly approaches, it's important that we secure the teachers in middle school and high school needed to teach the computer science courses. We want to make sure we have the proper teachers in place. So along with the computer science endorsement pathway training, it'll be coupled with a very targeted PD campaign called Reach Them All, which is aimed to ensuring all schools and districts have adequate information, training, and other resources necessary to provide it for that needed support. So what that is, it's a statewide reach. It's very targeted. They first identified delegates in each of the districts. And so the goal is to have one delegate for every district. Right now we have 130 signed up, and they will serve as a liaison to help plan logistics for the training. Then each district will have ambassadors on top of that, depending on the number of schools served. So every district will have 3 ambassadors at a minimum, and then for every additional 12 schools that are within that district, they get another ambassador. So like a large district like Shelby would have 12 ambassadors. Maybe one of our very small districts, like a special school district, would have the 3 ambassadors. We currently have 418 ambassadors signed up. They are all grade banded, elementary, middle, and high school. They will be receiving a 2-day training here in March to create a district plan, and they'll be tasked to implement the professional development in their districts to redeliver the training by fall of 23. There's also kits out there. So when Megan talked about our third party, we do partner with the Tennessee STEM Innovation Network to deliver the content, they help create the standards, they help create this endorsement pathway, and I'll go into the other demographics of people who also chimed in and led to the expertise in this endorsement pathway. Along with these Ambassadors, they're, like I said, they're also going to have like toolkits to take to every district. They're going to include grade appropriate resources and materials, model lessons, books, especially in our elementary to use with the comprehension, and then just a lot of computer science focused materials. So continuing kind of with the policy overview, Chapter 979 in Acts of 2022 requires the department to develop and submit to the state board a no-cost pathway to the computer science K-12 endorsement. Proposed revisions to the educator licensure policy 5.502 add a new option for how educators with a valid practitioner level or professional level Tennessee teaching license can obtain the computer science endorsement through an additional endorsement program developed and administered by TDOE. So there are some requirements, practitioner level or professional level licenses. They need to successfully complete the computer science endorsement pathway program that is both developed and administered by TDOE, be recommended by TDOE, and submit qualifying scores on the computer science endorsement pathway assessment. TDOE program required to be aligned to the appropriate specialty area standards identified in the Literacy and Specialty Area Standards Policy 5.05 as well. So just some of the details about this endorsement pathway. It was created, like I mentioned before, in collaboration with the Tennessee STEM Innovation Network, Tennessee educators, and industry and community partners. The modules include content-specific learning, which is performance-based activities, as well as formative assessments. And then there's also a work-based application. They need to submit a lesson plan. They collect student work. And then there is a reflection component at the very end. There is a final assessment that's associated with this. And to receive the endorsement, they must score at 80% or higher on the final exam. And this has been completely crosswalked with there's a computer science praxis exam out there, 5651, just to ensure that we're at the same rigor, that we're looking at, there's no gaps in the content that we're teaching. So each of the modules requires candidates to engage in content-specific learning through performance-based activities and formative assessments, like I said. The goal and the outcome of this was really to create a pathway for already licensed teachers to add computer science endorsement to their license that does not involve the cost of the exam like the praxis does. So some of the features are that it recognizes in the difference in expectations for integration versus direct instruction as outlined in the law for the grade progression. It is modeled after the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards process for certification. So within that, it provides the job-embedded practice, it provides opportunity to learn and demonstrate content mastery, and it promotes reflective practice. It does allow for a flexible timeline that allows teachers to start over the summer or even at the beginning of a semester and complete during the school year or vice versa. The estimated time to complete the modules is about 9 to 12 weeks, depending on how quickly they can implement the lesson plans. Each module has a separate component for content mastery, which can be completed without having students and requires having access to students in the subject area. So they can demonstrate content mastery with a task designed to showcase what they know. This component estimated to take about 2 hours if teachers have computer science knowledge, and just a little bit longer, they're saying about an hour longer if they're novice or the content is new. They also can demonstrate mastery by using existing lesson plans in any subject or grade they already use and integrate one or more computer science standards into it in a meaningful way. And there's going to be training, like I said, there's training like throughout with the Reach Them All to like kind of tee up the teachers. And then there is support that is given to the teachers while they're in the modules if they need any additional help. I wanted to kind of go through the timeline, how we created this. So after July of 2022, we had some K-12 educators apply to be part of the pathway development team along with some industry folks. A total of 18 members were selected, and so there was one person to ensure there was one person for K-5, 6, 8, and 9, 12 for each of the 6 modules. So 18 educators, 3 in the K-5, total of 3 for 6A and 3 for 9, 12, to ensure they have coverage for each of the 6 modules. There was also considerations was geographic and experience representation. So there's equitable distribution from each grand division in the state, and their experience ranged from 2 to 20 plus years of teaching experience, as well as we looked at the equity and the gender and the racial diversity. This 18-member team met virtually and were divided into topics to complete their task of identifying resources and developing tasks for each module using a template format. The templates were transferred to an online edX hosted course. edX is the learning platform right now used with other state PD courses for teachers, and that's why that was selected. Teachers who have enrolled previously in year-long computer science cohorts, such as our code.org training, were recruited to be testers. And so they tested all the content in the edX. They met with a facilitator for each of the grade bands monthly, virtually for 1 hour, to really just talk through the module content and provide peer support and feedback as they work through the course. So in addition to the Reach Them All targeted professional development campaign, we also have provided the following supports to our teachers. There's going to be a webinar to introduce the pathway and provide an overview of the course and how it is graded. And it's held within the 2 weeks of the link being released. The webinar is also recorded and it'll be available on demand to teachers enrolling in the course at any time. Teachers also can enroll at any time and work through it as an individual. Throughout the modules, the TSIN has been tasked with interviewing and retaining feedback on the development on the course content, just to, in a timely basis, just to make sure that their needs are being met and there's no gaps that we haven't identified. For those that wish to have more support, the TSIN will work with the 7 regional hubs that the TSIN hosts right now and host regional cohorts to meet in person on a regular basis to help complete the course in a cadence of monthly meetings and course completion roughly in 1 semester. So this will start here with this semester. And then also too, the TSIN will host a single cohort virtually for anyone across the state in the same cadence, just in case I can't make it in person to one of the regional hubs, just to ensure that their needs are being met as well. Teachers who have previously enrolled in our code.org training for computer science will have facilitation provided by the pathway embedded into their year-long coursework and experience. So their completion of the cohort will also earn completion of this endorsement pathway. So it's just going to run simultaneously for those folks. So we just have a lot of supports for teachers as they gear up to kind of look and take this additional endorsement pathway. One thing I noted before is we did ensure that we looked at the Praxis Crosswalk that's available right now. It's a K-12 endorsement. We ensured that the crosswalk included the technology application core, the program design and development, and the programming language topics. We also looked at a crosswalk of computer science concepts and computational thinking practices. So we had, as they designed this, they looked at the framework for the K-12 computer science education and the 5 core concepts that are associated with that, the AP computer science principles with the 7 big ideas, and exploring computer science, which is divided into 3 themes. All 3 courses consist of like I said, the 6 modules and the final exam. They're divided into an analyze, where this unit is designed to build background knowledge necessary for unpacking the standards. There's a design module. It will allow teachers to design lesson plans based on standards. An implementation module gives a teacher opportunity to implement the lesson plan, gather student feedback, and reflect on the lesson. And then there's an evaluation module as well, which allows for final reflection and evaluation of the lesson plan and standards. Since July, since this was since we brought it to you all in July, we're bringing it to you all now just for some minor clarifications. There has been a huge interest. And so looking at the numbers right now, we have over 1,500 teachers that have signed up for the computer science endorsement pathway. 773 teachers have signed up for the spring 2023, and 737 have enrolled for the fall of 2023. Right now, I've broken down those numbers for you. It's about 25.8% are elementary teachers, 37.7% are middle school teachers, and 36.6% are high school teachers. And we have 92.6% of the counties are actually represented. So it's a huge, there's a huge appetite for it. You know, when we looked at the legislation, we knew we needed about 1,000 teachers because we do already have our CTE teachers teaching a lot of this content. But we knew that if we brought this into every middle school and every high school as a standalone course, we would have to ensure that our teachers are well prepared to teach this content. But you can see our numbers have already exceeded that from the people who have signed up. So there's a huge appetite for it. They're excited about it. So we're just really looking forward to the results and coming back to the State Board Workshop a year from now and being able to report on the results and get some of the feedback from the candidates as well. So I'll be happy to take any questions.
That was a lot of information.
It's a lot of
And
information.
and a lot of it was not on the slide, so thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much for that. Do you have a question? Mr. Eby?
Yeah, thank you. So this is a K through 12 endorsement. They would be eligible to teach any of the grades, correct or incorrect?
So while it's a K through 12 endorsement, their initial license, whatever they're initially licensed in, is going to take precedence. And I can maybe get clarification from our licensing folks on that one. I don't know if they want to. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So if this is a K through 12 endorsement, would those teachers be eligible to teach any grade on the computer science?
I guess that's correct.
Okay, all right. And then you said that 92% of the counties, so that's my calculations, that's 4 or 5 counties that do not have people signed up. And since this is a requirement, what are we doing to reach those counties that aren't?
Yeah, that's a great question because we also have some, you know, when we talk about the Reach 'em All campaign, not all of our counties have a delegate or even ambassadors yet signed up. So we are looking at that and we are going to do some targeted communications with those folks to ensure that they, number one, know about the program, number two, or feel supported, and then talk them through the sign up on this. So, yeah.
And then the last question I have is, since the implementation, I think, is all going to be in 1 year, all K through 12, is that correct? How do we assure that those students that enter in 6th grade or 9th grade are caught up or don't fall behind, or how are we addressing that implementation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the computer science standards themselves are very scaffold. So there's a lot of tug and pull with them, but they're all very foundational. So at any time, they're very appropriate. So if the high schoolers 3 years from now already receive the middle school content, then we can scaffold those standards for more rigor. For those beginning ones, the first couple years, those beginning students, they're very foundational. So that's where we will start. So these standards are written to where we can start where the students are and then scaffold from there.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Mr. Jensen.
I have a question, a couple of questions. Thank you for the work you're doing. It's really headed in a great direction. So I was curious, when you say industry leaders, how have you obtained their thinking on what's needed in industry across the state? And maybe at this level, that's not such an important thing, but how did industry speak into this? And I mean, that's moving pretty fast, what industry's doing with computers. So that's a question. And then I have a second question around the occupational law that was passed in 2019 that allows for certification of industry professionals. And it was, I don't know if you're the right one to talk to or ask that, but it was passed, I think, in 2019 and maybe got lost in COVID, but it is a fair amount of money that's available to go after industry professionals to get them certified, so.
Yeah, no, great
Two
question. So I'll start with the first one, and I may ask for some assistance from my director who's kind of immersed in this world as well.
It seems the occupational piece fits in with this to get the
Absolutely.
kind of numbers of teachers that you
Yeah,
need.
absolutely. So the first thing is like, how do we engage with our industry professionals? So I know in the division of CCTE, we have a lot of industry councils that are aligned with our career cluster. So we have an IT advisory council that meets with our career cluster to help gauge are the standards of rigor, are there any gaps when we talk about emerging technologies and things like that? How are we addressing that and how are we keeping relevant with those standards? So we do continuously have conversations with industry folks in the division of CCT quite often. I know as a department, there's also a lot of engagement councils there that we can tap into. And there is a business and industry one there that at any time that we have a question such as this, we can absolutely get that council together, hold a meeting, and have some of these question answer type things, and have this dialogue with them. But I'm going to turn that question over also to Audra Block. She's our director of STEM and computer science at the department, and she was engaged in the process on how this was written with those industry professionals.
Thank you.
My name is Audra Block. I'm the Director of STEAM and Computer Science. And so one of the first things that we did is we met with the Nashville Tech Council to kind of identify who are the industry partners that we should involve in this undertaking. And then once that was done, we actually created a Computer Science Advisory Council that meets periodically. We meet quarterly to make these decisions, to make sure that not only are we in alignment with our post-secondary partners as well as our educational partners, but that industry is able to come in and kind of speak on those issues as well. And so currently we have a Computer Science Advisory Council that specifically does this, brings all of those players together so that we can make these decisions and make them effectively.
Follow up on that. I'm sure we have some teachers from West Tennessee. We have a little project over there that's going to produce about 30,000 jobs. And I know Ford is knocking on the doors of superintendents and principals, and they are working really hard at driving themselves into the schools because they know they've got to get the talent. Are they on this industry council?
So yes, we've had many conversations with Ford, and one of the great things is through conversations with them, we've implemented a number of different industry credentials that they're able to next year, like Lean Six Sigma will be something that they can get in computer science as well as STEM. So we have been engaging with them and identifying what their specific need is in West Tennessee. So we've met with them several times.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, Brooke Amos, Assistant Commissioner of Education, and appreciate the question on the Occupational Scholarship Program. That is one that we have been looking into. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to go back to my team and get a little bit more information on that, and we can circle back to you on that.
I would appreciate that very much.
Okay, of course,
It's
absolutely.
a fair amount of money to go and get industry professionals certified, so I would appreciate that very much.
Yes, absolutely. Of course. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much. You do? Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, Dr. Morrison.
I echo Mr. Jensen. This is a big lift, and you're going to be commended for figuring out how to take this on in a short amount of time. So I'll preface my questions by saying that I do have some questions and some concerns, I guess, based on what we just were hearing about the ESL and the SPED pathway. And I know we're going to talk in a little bit in the workshop about a more comprehensive approach to licensure, which I know both our teams are working towards, because I think this sets some new precedents for licensure. And I just think we have to be mindful of that in terms of comparing it to other pathways. So one question I have, kind of building on Mr. Eby, is for if it's a K-12 endorsement, will there be training for these educators? If they're a high school teacher, like I'm a former high school teacher, would I be trained on how to do, K-5? If that was something that I would end up teaching, are all grades going to be covered in terms of the pathway if it is a K-12 endorsement, or is it going to be specific to the, like, if you're a middle school teacher, you're going to be trained how to teach computer science in middle school?
Yes, while it's a K-12 endorsement, the pieces that they're asked to do, like the lesson plans and the content and the specific standards, we are asking them to stay within. So if they're in middle school, they're specifically looking at those middle school. If they're in elementary, they're looking at those elementary standards, and then high school, they're looking at those high school standards.
Which makes sense to me. I think a natural sort of extension would be that the endorsement then would be for that grade span, if that's what you're getting trained in, as opposed to K-12.
Yeah.
I agree, that makes sense. My question is the praxis would cover all K through 12, so if they're focusing on,
But they're not taking praxis. That's
oh, okay. It's
this
praxis
is-
like, though, it's, you compared it to the praxis, right?
Correct. We compared it in the practice to ensure that we didn't have any gaps within our
So if
endorsement, that we
they're
had covered
still
all
taking an
content.
exam, that's comparable to the praxis, yes or no?
Yes.
So if that test covers K through 12, and they're only focusing on 6 through 8, are we setting them up for failure?
So, no, actually, when you look at the endorsement pathway, it covers the pedagogical understanding that they would need to have K through 12. And so it does cover the breadth of standards, but then when they're actually delivering the standards to the students, they would use the standards that are applicable to that grade level. So they will have information from K through 12 so that they will be able to teach all of the standards if they were in a different grade band or move up or down.
And I just flagged this because we've never done that in the past in terms of an add-on endorsement that would be additional grades beyond your initial license, because there's a lot of pedagogical elements that as a high school teacher I wouldn't have for an elementary school student, for example. So the endorsement alone is not going to give that educator necessarily all the tools that they would need to be successful with different grades of students. That's my concern there. And then in terms of the test, I do have some questions because it's not a praxis. Is it going to be securely administered? How do we come up with the 80% cut? What kind of success metrics are we looking for? Because we saw a lot of attrition and the other pathways that we were talking about. Seems like a huge lift for the department to support this many educators if we were struggling with small numbers. I just, on your all's behalf, and I really do worry, it's a big lift.
Yeah. And we have looked at this test security. I'll have Audra talk more specifically to the test security.
It is a big lift, and we're so happy to have our partners at the Tennessee STEM Innovation Network to help us with this. Some of the things that we're looking at around test security, of course, we have multiple test versions that will be administered. The system locks down as you're taking the test so that you're not able to move to other platforms and look at information. We do have some pieces in place for people who don't pass the assessment. They'll have 2 attempts to take the assessment. After that, they do have to go through a remediation process where they have to redo modules and redo other coursework before they're allowed to jump into the test again. And so we're confident that with some of the measures that we've put in place that it should be a very secure testing platform.
And I do think having a pilot this spring is smart. Hopefully that's going to allow you to learn some of these things in real time, because it just still seems like a lot, again, in a short amount of time to take on. And it does set some new precedents. Again, we don't have any endorsements right now that you can earn without taking a praxis. So, fuel for further conversations around licensure.
Yes, Victoria?
I have a question for you, and it may be just my own not knowing. Is there a reason why they don't take the praxis, or can they take the praxis in order to fulfill the testing portion or the requirement?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if we kind of look at, currently we only have one EPP, and that EPP is Tennessee Tech. And since they've started their program, and I believe in 2019, they've had about 3 or 4 people that have passed the praxis. And so we don't believe that right now, based on the numbers, and we are working very closely with Tennessee Tech to make sure that the program that we're providing is rigorous. But we don't currently believe with the numbers that we've seen with them. They've had about 30 people in their program since 2019. And we don't see the numbers that we're need as far as 1,000 teachers going forward. So we believe that that is going to be a key piece in us being able to train up and really make sure that we have those teachers in place.
And the other piece of that is that you've indicated that the test has to be provided free. Praxis is not free. It was paid for in the SPED and ESL new pathways.
That is
so,
correct.
But in this one, it's not being paid for, which is why you had to come up with the alternative
That's
assessment.
Yeah, so the law says that it has to be free, yes.
A couple questions. Do we know why there's a 10% pass rate? Is it, I mean, do we have any understanding? I mean, if we're using that as a, oh, hey, 90%, you said 3 out of 30.
So,
If 90% of the people are
So,
not, is that 90%? Okay.
so looking at those numbers, there have only been about 2 or 3 people that have sat for the test. So out of those people that have joined the program, that's the only individuals that have actually
Oh,
sat
so
for
30 have been in the
praxis.
program, but only 3 have taken
Yes.
it and 2 have passed it.
Yes.
Okay, that's a different, all right, that's less concerning. Um, So, my sort of concern is a little bit echoed here already, but the unintended consequences. So we've been talking a lot about different pathways. We've all sat with superintendents who've talked about cut scores and how do we take people from different professions and bring them into the education. We look at the education shortage and just every deviation from a current pathway, I fear has two unintended I mean, just it confuses people on how do I get licensed, and the answer is greatly increasing towards it depends what you're going for, and I think that just gets hard for teachers. And then I know the law says it has to be free, but there's a lot of different ways to do free. I mean, people can get vouchers back to take the praxis because I'm sure there's a cost to all the programs, and so I don't know. I just like Dr. Morrison just said, there's a concern level of all the different ways that we have, or all the different pathways we're creating and the precedent that each one sets, that another group is going to say, hey, but computer science is doing it this way, so we in math want to do it this way, and then we in English want to do it this way, and then the EPPs over here going, hold on now, and so just being mindful of a clarified system that is ultimately trying to create an ease of use to the teachers with a quality control from the Department of Ed, and just keeping that in mind, I just want to encourage us to do.
No, those are all great thoughts, and it is something that, like I said, a year from now, it would be great to see kind of where we are, and, we're going to always be in tune. We're always going to make those adjustments if we need to. We're going to be looking at the numbers. We're going to be looking at the test security. We're going to be looking at all of these things. So definitely going to be very mindful of everything you said. I appreciate that.
One more question, I just thought, do we know why so few people have done the program at Tennessee Tech but then not taken the praxis? Is it because they're going into a different field, or?
I'm not sure. I do have the numbers on that. I will get with the program director and I can give you more information.
Okay, I just think the more we can know about the one place that's actually doing this as an EPP would be great.
Awesome.
And I do talk with him on a regular basis, but I do not have the answer to that question. But you raised a valid point that was, it's often an issue for EPPs too, as you pointed out. Here's another option through this pathway, through the TDOE, and an EPP is providing, and their courses are pretty rigorous, and so they're concerned that mine's more rigorous than perhaps these, and sometimes we're comparing apples to oranges, and one has to pay and one doesn't have to pay. But Tennessee Tech is the only EPP in the state that's doing this, and so we have a much larger need, and so there's obviously rationale for why this approach is being taken. And so I think it has to be couched in those terms. We have a huge need, and we have a law. The law was passed. We're going to follow the law, as we always do. Yes, Mr.
Yeah, one final question. So if you have like 750 that are going to be taking it this spring, how soon will you know what % of those will have passed and will be eligible to teach the course? I mean, 1,000 teachers, it is a big lift. And so how soon will we know that we're going to meet that need?
So we're telling teachers that we would like for them to have it completed within one semester. And so we're hoping to have data by the end of this school year, although we are allowing teachers to take up to, in some cases, a year. But we'll have some baseline data at the end of this school year.
When is the pilot? You mentioned the pilot. When will that be concluded, and will we be able to see the results or have a report from the pilot?
Yeah, so they're currently taking some of the pilot modules, and so at the end of this semester, we'll be able to share that data with you. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
I just have another question on the EPP side. Is there incentive for other EPPs to add this program of study? Like, are we creating incentives? If we have this law that's creating a new demand, are we incentivizing an increase in supply?
I'll have to, we'll have to read through the bill. Right now, we don't have an incentive program for those EPPs, although we've reached out to several. And we would like to add that Tennessee Tech is also participating with us and is
Awesome.
planning to use our endorsement pathway in their coursework.
Oh, so they're gonna say, okay, you can pick the praxis or the,
Yes.
this way. All right.
Other questions, comments? Yes, Mr. Jensen?
With the imminent expansion of TCATs, which obviously an awful lot of that is computer-based, is that in your plan or in your connectivity somewhere?
So tomorrow, we're going to bring some graduation substitution as first read. And so we're hoping that some of our CTE, like our coding courses and things like that, can count for this computer science requirement. So that'll help those students. And as they, go through their CT coursework, if they try to, and then they can go on then to TCAT and they'll be prepared as well.
Very good. Thank you both very much.
Great.
Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
presentation today. We are, yes, Mr.
Madam Chairman, just on the issue of praxis in general, I wanted to make sure that the members know that next Wednesday in the Senate Education Committee will be Senate Bill 556 by Senator Powers. And I know many of you have been following a push and a discussion around having the praxis paid for at the state level. So that will be an issue that's taken up in the Senate Education Committee next week.
Thank you. I know we took a lot of time. That was important to do. We're 2 presentations behind, so we're now going to move on to the next one, the 2022 Authorizer Evaluation Outcomes. Ms. Allie Reed.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, Allie Reed, Director of Engagement and Accountability for the State Board. Pleased to speak with you today about our 2022 Authorizer Evaluation Outcomes and some proposed changes that you will have on first reading before you tomorrow. So I'll start with, if this clicks, there we go. Start with a brief history and overview of our process. In 2019, that's when the General Assembly amended the charter law and charged the state board with the responsibility of ensuring effective operation of authorizers in the state and evaluating authorizer quality. So we spent the next year building our evaluation process, and in fall 2020, we conducted a pilot evaluation to test the process and the tools. In February 2021, we finalized our evaluation rule in preparation for the first formal evaluation of 3 of our 6 authorizers. And then this past fall, 2022, we completed our first full cycle with the 3 remaining authorizers in our state. These are our evaluation cohorts on the screen. Authorizers are evaluated at least biennially, though depending on the outcome of an evaluation, this may change, may be more or less frequent. At the conclusion of our first full cycle, though, we do not have any authorizers who are moving off of their current 2-year cycle. In terms of the timeline for the evaluation, we begin this work in August with an orientation. We moved through 3 different evaluations and then conclude with your vote tomorrow on approving the ratings. Each evaluation team was comprised of experienced authorizers and evaluators, and the table on the slide documents our evaluation teams for 2022. You'll notice that one authorizer had 2 evaluators rather than 3, and this is something new that we experienced for the first time this round. One of the beautiful things about the relationships that our authorizers have built with one another is that they are working really closely together, but that also sometimes causes some conflicts of interest. And so we take those potential conflicts really seriously, and so that created a challenge in setting these evaluation teams. And so we had to recuse a few individuals from evaluating this year, myself included, to ensure that our process remains impartial and trustworthy. Each evaluation focuses on a 2-year review term, and we evaluate documentation, the processes and practices that occurred during that review term. If it's outside of it, it's not considered. Authorizers submit corresponding documents for randomly selected schools in their portfolio, and then our evaluation teams review those documentation pieces as well as have conversations with the authorizer themselves and the school leaders. And they also will consider any appeals history as applicable that occurred during the review term. The State Board approved evaluation rubric is based on our policy 6.111 and covers the 6 categories that you see here. That last category, the advanced standards, allowed authorizers an opportunity to earn bonus points. But I want to flag that as we look towards raising the bar in this next full cycle, we are proposing a change in that policy to eliminate the opportunity for bonus points, taking those standards and moving them up into the appropriate categories that they fall under, and therefore no longer having an opportunity for bonus points moving forward. We believe this is the right step in just raising the bar for our process, and our authorizers are ready to do this with us moving forward. The substandard ratings are then averaged to determine the overall score, which you see here. Authorizers receive an evaluation report, and that includes their final scores, evaluative comments for each of the substandards on the rubric, and an overall rating and any required follow-up actions. So they get a lot of feedback through this process. Those evaluation reports are what you have to approve on first and final tomorrow. And once those are approved, they will be posted on State Board's website. Any questions about the process? Okay. In terms of our 2022 evaluations, we evaluated 3 authorizers this round. That was Metro Nashville Public Schools, the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission, and the Achievement School District. And I'll walk through each of their outcomes next. Starting with Metro Nashville, they were the first authorizer that we evaluated this round, and they opened their first charter school in 2007. Their charter schools currently serve approximately 17% of the district's students, and they have 27 schools in operation. I'll highlight the key areas of strength for each of the authorizers and then their areas for growth as a result of the evaluation. And I want to note that the evaluation report includes a great deal more of feedback than these points here. So for Metro Nashville, our evaluation team identified 3 key areas of strength. The first being that the authorizer implements a quality application process that's aligned to state guidelines. They provide technical guidance for exceptional education support to their schools, and their school leaders spoke really highly of that. And they host an annual charter school meeting at the start of each school year. Additionally, their team has worked to better align their charter agreements to the requirements of our standards and clearly define the terms for amendments to those agreements. As for their areas of growth, the authorizer lacks a comprehensive and clearly defined accountability and compliance monitoring system that's both aligned to the requirements in their charter agreement as well as informing decisions. Additionally, the authorizer implements an intervention process that's not currently aligned to the process they have in their own handbook, and they are inconsistently providing schools when considering a renewal and a cumulative report, which is required in law, and has not established or clearly communicated, as I'm doing, the criteria for renewal. For their overall score, they received a 2.2, which did fall in the satisfactory category. And each of our overall ratings has required follow-up action. So for Metro Nashville receiving this satisfactory rating, they will be required to submit a self-assessment in this next school year as required for all authorizers in their non-evaluation year. Any questions on the outcomes for Metro Nashville?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Holt.
So I'm interested in what your sense of what Metro's plans are in order to continue to move up. I mean, a 2.2 for barely in the satisfactory is better than it could be, but also it seems like there's a lot of room for improvement. And so, do you have a sense from your interactions with Metro schools what their plan is to continue moving up on that scale?
Yeah. So in conversation with their staff, they have struggled with some staff turnover. And so I think one of the big pieces that they're working on is putting all of these processes, making sure that they're clearly stated in policy. So that would require their local board members to review and approve and engage in that process. And then also ensure that those processes aren't changing should there be staff turnover moving forward. So that is one of the things that I know they're working really hard on implementing. And as part of this non-evaluation year that they'll be in this coming school year, one of the goals in terms of the self-assessment is to respond and reflect to the areas where you didn't score as well, regardless of your score. And so they will be working on adjusting those areas and then in the self-assessment actually commenting on what steps they've taken to make improvements as well.
And as a follow-up, are there resources or best practices that you and the other evaluators are saying that the most successful authorizers are using that could be shared or are being shared with some of the authorizers who have not performed as highly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but all of our authorizers have opportunities to connect with one another, and they are doing that frequently. And so some of our more high-performing authorizers are regularly sharing resources, documents, being asked questions, and just presenting best practices to the other authorizers. So that is common practice at this point for our authorizing staff to engage in.
Okay. Now, I read through the detailed report for Metro Nashville, and one of my concerns was clearly articulating what the standard is for renewal of a charter agreement, and then providing updates to schools on where they stand with respect to it, and then applying that standard when it's time for a reauthorization. Is that something that other authorizers are doing really well, where there could be resources or tools that could be helpful for that?
Yeah, I think Shelby County Schools, I should say Memphis Shelby County Schools, is doing a really great job with that. They have experienced probably the most number of renewals as they have the largest portfolio. And so they have a lot of great processes in place for that. Some of our authorizers just haven't been through that process yet. And so they don't have that quite the implementation side of things sorted out. That is not necessarily the case for Metro Nashville, but they can certainly look to an authorizer like Memphis Shelby County for support in what types of resources they have and how they're communicating with their schools about their status.
Great, thank you.
Our second authorizer evaluated this round is the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. And the Charter Commission had 4 schools in operation during the 2021-2022 school year. And they also had 5 additional schools in development. As you likely remember, the Charter Commission is our state's appellate body, and they authorize schools that they approve upon appeal, which was a responsibility they took over from the state board in 2021. I also want to note, given my previous role at the state board in close relationships with their schools, their staff, and their processes, I did recuse myself from serving as an evaluator for this evaluation, and instead functioned as a project manager to remove any potential conflicts of interest. Our evaluation team here identified 3 key areas of strength, and that is that the authorizer enlists a competent team with expertise and experience in all areas essential to charter school oversight, including charter application review. They also have a comprehensive and detailed performance accountability and compliance monitoring system that's well-defined and informs their decisions. And they also are making decisions that will result in positive student outcomes. As for their areas of growth, the evaluation team identified 3 key adjustments for the Charter Commission, which includes, while they do have a comprehensive monitoring system, as I just mentioned, there is room for streamlining to minimize potential for administrative burdens on their schools. Additionally, the authorizer demonstrated evidence of periodically reviewing compliance requirements, but it wasn't clear how the outcome of those reviews is used to increase school autonomy, which is part of our standards. And then the authorizer at the time lacked transparency in its use of funds to demonstrate resource allocations. The Charter Commission received our highest score of our 6 authorizers, a 3.9 out of 4, which is exemplary. And the Charter Commission will, as their follow-up, complete a self-assessment during the 23-24 school year. And I'm also going to highlight several of their best practices. So for one, I just really want to commend their authorizing staff, as there are several best practices they implement that go far beyond the 5 that you see listed here. But their team also, as I've mentioned, regularly shares resources with other authorizers across the state, which takes a lot of additional time and energy to do, and I just really appreciate them for constantly being willing to do that. So some 5 best practices to highlight for the Charter Commission that our evaluation team determined through the evaluation is that they are conducting a rigorous, transparent, and thorough New Start appeal process. And that is, of course, part of actually the appeal. So it's a second step, but they are still responsible for reviewing applications. And they have added resources and supports that they've designed themselves to ensure that all applicants understand each step of that appeal process. They've also developed a comprehensive reporting calendar. It's well communicated to their schools and aligned to their performance accountability. They maintain ongoing communication with their schools, and they regularly engage in feedback to ensure their schools are supported and heard. That's something we heard echoed from all their school leaders. Additionally, all major functions of authorizing are defined in policy. They're also published on their website and clearly communicated to schools in advance. So there's a lot of transparency there. And they've developed a strategic plan for authorizing with priorities, with goals, timelines, and provide their decision makers with quarterly progress updates. So any questions or additional notes about the Charter Commission?
Madam Chair. Madam
Yes.
Chair. A couple comments. One, Allie, thank you for your work on this. You've answered, I'm sure, many questions over the last few weeks from members of the board and staff. I'm proud of how the new commission has set an example. I also understand that they had kind of a fresh slate, and they maybe that makes it a little bit easier for them to put some things into place as opposed to some of the other chartering organizations. But I think your comment earlier about in the question about the opportunities to collaborate and share best practices, the hope, of course, is that everyone elevates towards that exemplary status. And I'm grateful that we have the commission and as I understand Memphis Shelby too, that is really just a great example of how this can be done really well. And I know that your heart is in seeing the tide rise, helping all of them elevate towards that, and would just say if there's anything that we can do along that journey and in that effort, please let us know. I know we're going to talk about another one here in just a moment, but it's good to recognize the wins. I think it's also great that that the scoring recognized the wins, but we also recognize that there's still opportunity to get better, and we never want to lose sight of the fact that perfection is never quite achieved. But this is an impressive score, and I'm delighted to see that the commission has come out of the gate so strong. And thank you for, if she's watching Tess, the leadership that she's shown in that effort. Thank you.
Thanks. Other comments? Mr.
I
Jensen.
just wanted, we received a piece of hand-delivered mail at each of our desks, and this is the charter school report that's in it. It's pretty well done document, so just take a look at that as well.
We will. Thank you. You want to move on to the next one?
Yes. Okay. Our third and final evaluation that we conducted this round is for the Achievement School Districts. So the ASD is another unique authorizer that operates within the Department of Education and was established to serve as an intervention for some of the state's lowest performing schools. The ASD operated 26 charter schools during the 21-22 school year and served over 8,000 students. Our evaluation team, again, identified 3 key areas of strength. First being that the authorizer executes charter agreements that define the material terms and allow occasional material changes. They also respect their school's authority over day-to-day operations. And as of July 1, 2022, they've hired an entirely new team that is working to put new practices and processes in place and to consistently communicate expectations to their schools. In terms of the areas for growth, the evaluation team identified the following. First, while the charter agreements did have some bright spots, as I just mentioned, there are several details that were absent from the agreements, including the rights and responsibilities of the school and the performance standards that are used to inform decision-making. Additionally, the authorizer lacks a consistent compliance and monitoring system that ensures students' rights are protected and the terms of the agreement are followed, and has not yet established an intervention policy or process that's clearly communicated and implemented as needed with their schools. The ASD received an overall score of 1.5, which is an approaching satisfactory. So their required follow-up actions are a little different. They are still required to submit the self-assessment for the 22-23 school year, but additionally, they will be required to submit a corrective action plan that's approved by our executive director prior to implementation, and they'll work on implementing that plan over the course of this year. Any questions about the ASD's evaluation?
Would you just remind us, the Achievement School District reports to the,
The Department of Education?
okay.
Yes.
That's what I thought. And they've been in existence for a number of years. There's been new leadership over the years as well, I guess turnover in the staff. So do you, in terms of the whole management team of that, are you seeing any indications that the new team that's in place, and I don't know how long they've been in place, are getting it and they're on the path to addressing the changes? Do you see hope and signs that they'll go above the approaching status?
Yes, so they have an entirely new staff as of July this last year, and I am really excited about the people that are doing this work now. They have made a lot of positive changes in a short amount of time, and I think their schools have noticed that too. But when we think about these evaluations, they span the course of 2 years, and so unfortunately that's a short amount of time in the course of the 2-year evaluation that they've been in place. But I am really hopeful with what they've done so far.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question.
Yes, Mr. Holt.
So in addition to the providing this feedback and evaluation, and then creating avenues for collaboration, which I think are very valuable among the authorizers, are there other ways that the department or the state board are able to provide supports to authorizers in areas where we've identified that there are issues that, areas of growth?
Yeah, it's a tricky place to be, and one that I'm regularly struggling with because I want to provide a lot of support, resources, create templates, etc. But in our role of the state board as the evaluator, we also have to balance, we can't be giving all of these documents and then essentially evaluating ourselves. And so that is why I've built up opportunities for authorizers to work together and share resources that way. But one of the things, and I'll talk about this next too, but one of the things I'm looking to do is really build more buy-in and engagement with the leadership and the decision makers for our authorizers, who oftentimes are not as aware of this evaluation process or the work that their staff is doing. So we've built up a lot of buy-in among the staff members for the authorizers and want to now focus on, okay, let's get that engagement and find out what supports and resources they need, and then how can we provide that in a way that still makes sense given our role as an evaluator.
And not to jump too far ahead, or if this is something that you're, isn't in a stage to talk about yet, but do you have a vision for what creating avenues for collaboration among the decision makers could be like, or at least conversations, so that if there are things that certain authorizers are doing where it would be helpful for the decision makers of other authorizers to be aware of it, that is something that we could help facilitate?
Yeah, I haven't thought too much about that yet, but I certainly am relying on just the knowledge and relationships that TOS and TSBA have established with those superintendents, the leadership, and then our local school board members for TSBA, and what they've learned, and then what resources and opportunities there are to plug in with them to engage with those members. So I think that's a great idea and something that those organizations do naturally, and we could be able to just plug into that directly too.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll call on one of you. How about that, Mr. Morrow?
I was going to be calling him. Just for, I guess, context, how far of a gap is it? So the Achievement School District's 1.5, Metro Schools 2.2. Sort of how, is that a huge difference between the two? Or is that, they're pretty close together? Like, what is our range? Like a standard deviation, for lack of a better term, like how far apart is the Achievement School District from Metro Schools, and how far apart is that from getting at meeting expectations?
Mm-hmm. So I pulled up this slide. I don't have the exact scores on this slide, but it gives you a sense of how all 6 of the authorizers fared. So you see a pretty equal split here. But in terms of the difference, we did have another authorizer, so I'm going to talk about them in a moment, who just completed a corrective action plan, and their score wasn't too significantly far off from where the Achievement School District landed this year. Same for our satisfactory and then approaching, exemplary. So I wouldn't say that there's big gaps there, but I'm going to talk in a moment about the changes that we're proposing, and those really focus on the standards. And so I think that's the next iteration, is adjusting the standards so that they all align and make sense, and we're not offering opportunity for free points, which we've seen. And then the next phase will be actually raising the rating ranges themselves. So I think that there's an opportunity to kind of push those a little bit too. But didn't want to do that all at the same time while also changing the standards. So that is to come, but the ones that are in the same categories aren't too far off from one another.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Mullenhour.
Thank you.
Sorry about
I have
that.
a few questions, and I'm going to make a few statements first, and my question is, please correct me where I'm mistaken. The Achievement School District has been in operation for about a decade or so, and the goal, for those who may not be familiar with it, of the Achievement School District is to essentially take over schools or run schools that have performed below a certain threshold to help turn around those schools and help those kids to have the opportunities that we all want them to have. In the last year or two, I think a few schools exited that program successfully, leaving the program with 100% of the students in the Achievement School District within charter schools. Is that a correct understanding?
That's correct. And we've also seen there are new pathways for schools that are coming up on their 10-year renewal term, or their opportunity for renewal, end of their 10-year term, who have successfully transitioned to the Charter Commission. We saw that just the other day. They accepted a whole new crop of schools from the ASD, and they also have opportunities now, pathways to go back to or reapply to return to Memphis, Shelby County. So there are a few additional pathways too.
Okay. So I guess, and this is me speaking, I'm not speaking for the board, although some may agree. I'm a little frustrated in the sense that, we as a community, the board and the Department of Education, working together on things, we should be setting the goalposts. Like we should be the example for others to follow. And if I were another district and had received a score anything above a 1.5, the first thought I would have is, well, why are you guys pointing at me and saying, critiquing me if I've scored better than essentially the department's own efforts in this same way? And I realize that things are changing. There's been turnover. There's been changes in staff, and maybe we are on trajectory to being that example. But I think it's a very important score, and not just because of the students within the Achievement School District. I think it's because this helps set the standards that we should expect from every district that wants to come before an evaluator. So I guess I'm a little frustrated in the sense that we're behind in the way that we are. I know Eve Carney is not here today, and as I understand, she's the one who's sort of in charge of this for the department. So I'll reserve a couple of those questions for tomorrow. But my main question to her would be, what can we do, if anything, the board? What can we do to help? Because we want to see, ideally, again, the tide rise for all, and we don't need to be subjecting ourselves or the department or the board or really in the minds of others, the state, in a role of expecting people to do things that we have not yet achieved ourselves. So I'm seeing Robin talk back there. Is Eve Carney here?
She's not, but
Okay,
we do
okay.
have Charlie Buffalino, so
Okay.
happy to have him join too.
Okay. So my thought is just, we've got to get ahead of this, and what are we doing to effectuate that? I'll relate this to the private sector. When you buy a company or you have a turnaround type project, doing more of the same thing almost never works. You have to come in and you have to make very disciplined, strategic decisions, oftentimes changing leadership at all levels to make, to effectuate that objective. And I'm simply asking, again, what can we do to help, if anything?
So, Charlie Bufalino with the Department of Education. I appreciate the question, and we absolutely agree with the sentiment. And I think we have implemented some major changes to the Achievement School District in the past 2 years. I spoke with Dr. Eve Carney earlier today. She apologizes for not being here. Those changes fundamentally have shifted how the ASD is going to operate, right? The ASD has not authorized a new school since 2015, 2016. There hasn't been a new school that came in the portfolio. There actually are several schools that have closed and been returned to the district. I think there are 4 or 5 total since we passed a new piece of legislation in 2021. That created the pathway to the commission. That also created some standards for schools to be returned, schools that could continue, and provided some clarity for those operators. And it also coincided with the shift to ASD 2.0. We believe in the Achievement School District. We also know how difficult school turnaround work is, and the state has started exploring additional options across 3 tiers of intervention, the Achievement School District being the last and most intensive one. For example, it was a turnaround pilot program that got established also in 2021 that we worked with Speaker Pro Tem Hale on to establish, which established some private-public partnerships in order to do some turnaround opportunities before it got into the ASD as well. So there are multiple strategies that are going on here.
Charlie, if I can interject for just
please.
a moment, just to kind of parse out something here, and this may be an unfair question to you because I know you don't, you have a lot of other responsibilities. So if we need to reserve this question for Ms. Carney, I can do that. 2 things. One is I understand that turning around the schools is itself challenging, but what we're talking about here is the discipline, the processes, and the evaluation process of the ASD itself, which in my mind are 2 completely different things. Except for one thing, if we can't do this well, if we can't get the processes and the disciplines and the rigors in place to manage ourselves well, we shouldn't expect to be able to then go into other schools and manage them better. So I understand that there's difficulties in the work that they do. I guess I'm looking at this more as an evaluation of their housekeeping. So the second question is, the question that follows that is, can you give us 2 or 3 examples of these significant changes that have occurred, just so that we have some context as to what you mean? Because again, I want to make sure that nobody is expecting different results if we keep doing the same thing. Even if we change some staff people out, is that ultimately going to be sufficient to get on the track that we want to be on?
So that's where I was going with my response, and I apologize for not getting to it more quickly. So that is what I mean if it's a fundamentally different Achievement School District. Rather than having a large portfolio of schools, and one of the biggest shifts is that we're not directly running schools anymore, right? There was a fair amount of schools in the ASD portfolio that the department was operating directly. We don't think we were effective in doing that, and that is why we are not running any schools directly anymore and focusing solely on charter schools within that. We then shrank the staff that was doing that and redefined roles to be in a more proper sort of authorizing and support structure because of that. So I think it speaks directly to your point of trying to be able to focus on some of those things more. And I want to be clear too, it is very helpful for us to receive this feedback, and we already have a corrective sort of action plan ready to go and have taken sort of several steps in anticipation for the formality of getting the green light to continue and finish all of that. We take this sort of seriously, and we think there are lots of things that we can improve on pretty quickly in this area. But the only point I'm trying to convey is this is fundamentally a different Achievement School District than it was 3 years ago.
Follow-up question then, what is the plan for the leadership? My understanding is that previous leadership exited. There's been sort of this interim, kind of ongoing interim period. Is that one of the fundamental changes that you're anticipating, is a permanent leader who's personally responsible for the long-term performance of this district?
Yes, thanks for that question. Yes, and I'd also say that I think Dr. Eve Carney would say that this falls under her portfolio, and her team and her Assistant Commissioner Robin Kopp oversee all elements of school turnaround. So I think they would say that the buck stops with them.
Okay. I have a couple of other questions, but I'll reserve those tomorrow for Ms. Carney. Thank you for the perspective.
You're welcome.
Continue, please.
Okay, so before I share some reflections on the evaluation overall, I want to provide an update on the outcome of our 2021 authorizer who was on a corrective action plan. So Hamilton County Schools was placed on a corrective action plan as a result of their 2021 outcomes last year, and that ran through January 1st of this year. So here are the results. Hamilton County Schools developed a plan that included 7 different action items to be completed throughout 2022, and that included developing a comprehensive performance framework, amending its charter agreements to include that framework as an exhibit, and to create a renewal policy with a process and criteria clearly outlined. The authorizer worked on its action items between March and December, and they've completed all of their items. So you may have even caught a news article in late fall that discussed Hamilton County School Board's vote to amend all of their charter agreements. And these agreements were amended in response directly to the feedback that we gave them through their evaluation, and it was a requirement of their corrective action plan. I will note that for all the supporting documentation that they submitted as a requirement of this corrective action plan, our staff only evaluated the items for completion and did not assess the quality of these items. And that is because they will be completing another evaluation this year. And so that is when our evaluation team will fully assess the quality of those documents. Should this authorizer earn a score of approaching satisfactory or unsatisfactory in this next round, then our executive director may recommend that the authorizer fee, a portion of the authorizer fee, be withheld. Any questions about Hamilton County's outcomes of their corrective action plan?
Just curious, when you talk about withholding the authorizer fee, how much money are we talking about there? I mean, we've got the carrots and we've got the stick. So 50% of that fee is how much?
It varies by authorizer, but if you, some of you are good at quick math. So if it's $35,000 per school, and Hamilton County currently oversees 8 schools, that's how much they are collecting each year. So we would take up to half of that.
$135,000. Thank you.
And the process for getting to the point where a part of an authorizer fee is withheld is being below satisfactory and then not having a satisfactory corrective action plan?
So there's a couple of pathways. Scoring unsatisfactory 2 evaluations back to back. Scoring approaching satisfactory or unsatisfactory in a year following a corrective action plan, or not completing all of the items on a corrective action plan.
Okay. And then Mr. Eby mentioned carrots as well. Are there financial incentives for being at the top, or is it, I mean, obviously being recognized as having done very well through the evaluation is hopefully something in and of itself, but I was curious if there are any kind of financial rewards or incentives or things along those lines.
I guess you could say there are, in terms of if an authorizer scores exemplary 2 years or 2 consecutive cycles in a row, then they would be exempt from completing another evaluation in the following cycle. That's not forever, that's 1 cycle, but considering how much time and energy and staff manpower it requires to complete these evaluations, you could potentially consider that a financial incentive.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
That was a good swing. Okay. So in terms of just reflections, I think probably way too much about these evaluations, but just want to share some thoughts that I have moving forward. So as you know, this is an iterative process, and we rely really heavily on our authorizers and our evaluators to continue to refine this process. So last year we discussed changes that we wanted to consider following the completion of the full evaluation cycle, and so I'll share where we're at with that for this year. So I showed this slide earlier. This is just, again, a quick snapshot of our 6 authorizers, how they fared in their first round of evaluations. And we have that pretty even split. We do expect to see growth between the first and second full rounds, and I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you in the next 2 years. The proposed changes that you'll have before you tomorrow were developed in response to these first 2 years of evaluations and discussions with our authorizers and national consultants. The majority of the changes really exist in policy 6.111, which is our quality authorizing standards. Those are the standards we use in the evaluation, and I discussed the potential changes that are proposed to you tomorrow with our authorizers during a meeting in January. I have also just created a lot of opportunities for our authorizers to provide feedback outside of this in-person meeting. It is just an ongoing part of our process, and I do want to note that that's something that's unusual. When I speak with other states who have an evaluation process anywhere similar to ours, they're constantly talking about how it's a struggle for buy-in with their authorizers, and that's just not a problem that we're seeing because they've been part of this process from the beginning, and I really appreciate the opportunity to work beside them on this. I know also that our authorizers really value having a seat at the table, and they have been really fair about what's best practice for all authorizers, regardless of their outcomes. So tomorrow on first reading, you'll see updates to our rule, which includes just a timeline for adding in new authorizers. And then we are also updating policy 6.113, which is a companion piece to the rule. The majority of the changes in that policy appear in the appendix, which is the actual evaluation rubric. And as I mentioned, the evaluation rubric is tied to our 6.111 policy. That's where, again, the majority of those changes are. And the red line version can look a little overwhelming, but really a lot of the revisions involve just a reorganization of the standards to remove duplications, to better group them by topic, and to eliminate any free points that authorizers received in this first round for utilizing required state templates, applications, and rubrics. Additionally, we're adding language to require authorizers to document those key authorizing responsibilities in local board policy. Some of them do have this in place, but we're going to make it across the board an expectation of the standards. And we believe this is really important because it's going to require engagement from local school board members to review and approve each policy, again, if they don't have that in place, and then cement those policies and those practices so that they're not lost in transition when there is staff turnover, which is a problem that we've seen as well. This also, of course, creates more stability for our charter schools to know what's expected of them, and that's not changing from each administration. Our evaluation documents that accompany these, of course, will be updated to reflect those changes. And then with that, as I mentioned earlier, our plan is to implement another round of evaluations with these new or updated standards, followed by a look into the overall rating ranges to continue to raise the bar. As we're thinking about evaluation outcomes and follow-up actions, I just want to end with a note about what's being done to support our authorizers in this work. So last year I began facilitating a bi-monthly Authorizer Connect meeting, and at our authorizers' request have continued to facilitate that throughout this school year. So our authorizers select topics for discussion. They bring their staff members to these meetings, and they have an opportunity to share their own best practices or things they're doing well, as well as an opportunity to request help from their fellow authorizers too. In my opinion, the best thing that's really come out of this is those relationships I mentioned, and I see them constantly working together and sharing resources, which is a really great thing. We've also continued to provide authorizers with access to video modules that cover all aspects of authorizing at a high level, and we found that that's really useful for new staff members as well as new authorizers such as Rutherford County, who will be opening its first charter school in the near future. And this year, my focus, as I've previewed earlier, is to really start to work more with our local school board members and superintendents through engagement and support of the two organizations, the superintendent organization, TOS, and then the school board association, TSBA, to partner on how do we best work together on really understanding the importance and value and work that's required to move these results forward and to move these best practices forward. Additionally, we've continued to offer our quality authorizing series, which is designed to support districts receiving applications for either the first or second time, and particularly those who do not currently operate a charter school. And so this year, our state received a total of 21 charter school applications as of February 1st, and those are spread across 8 districts, 4 of which do not currently operate a charter school. And so we held a session on February 2nd on how to conduct a quality application review to start training and supporting those authorizers or potential authorizers. All right, I think we're at the end here. So with that, open it up to any other questions.
Other questions? Comments? Thank you very much. A lot of details once again. We're a little bit behind, and so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next presentation, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are going to continue on. We were supposed to take a break a little while ago. We'll take a break after this presentation. So Dr. Laird, we can cue it up for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is David Laird. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Assessment and Accountability. And in the broad strokes of what I'm going to detail in this presentation is to provide an update on and sort of the final destination that the department has arrived at in accountability adjustments that are necessary to bring our accountability system into compliance with a series of federal findings, compliance findings for our accountability system. Now, I realize not everybody is fortunate enough to get up and think about accountability calculations every single day. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time providing a little bit of the context here again. So I'll stipulate what are some of the broad structural requirements that exist for accountability systems, either at the federal level, at the state level. We'll also detail our interaction with the state board around issues of accountability calculations. I'll also detail essentially what the original findings were. So what did the department need to achieve for USED to bring our accountability system into compliance? There were 4 findings that I'll talk through. I'll then detail what has been our progress and process to engage with the field in developing solutions, and finally, where the department has arrived in developing solutions to address each of these 4 findings, and then talk about next steps. So quickly, in terms of just an overview of the legal requirements in this space, there's a variety of federal requirements, both for assessing at the state level and for accountability systems. There are a number of assessments that we are required to administer at various grade levels in various subject areas. As far as accountability systems go, the federal government has a number of requirements. The first is a system of long-term goals. We'll know this in the state as annual measurable objectives, or AMOs. That is Tennessee's operational response to the federal requirement to have a series of long-term goals. There's an additional federal requirement for having a system of annual meaningful differentiation, which means that each state is required to have a series of indicators, some of which are required at the federal level, that are used to array the performance of all schools in the state. The required indicators at the federal level are an achievement indicator, which we'll talk a lot about today because a number of the findings that Tennessee has to respond to specifically deal with the achievement indicator, which functionally is percent proficient. So what percentage of students on any given test are proficient at that time? We're also federally obligated to have a growth measure. So what has the change in performance been over time? We're federally reported to have a graduation rate, and we're federally reported to have a test of English language proficiency. I'll also say that the federal government also gives every state the opportunity to add additional indicators to their annual system of meaningful differentiation. So in Tennessee's original ESSA plan, we identified chronic absenteeism as an additional indicator that feeds this process, as well as our measure of college and career readiness, or our Ready Graduate indicator. So we're required to have a variety of indicators, some of them with very specific federal requirements, some optional indicators, and we use these to array performance of all the schools in the state. So moving down to the state level, I think most impactful here is that annual system of meaningful differentiation that I just described. State law requires that that system is essentially funneled into a series of letter grades. So the need to produce a letter grade is not actually a federal requirement, that is a Tennessee requirement. So all of the indicators that I just described, we need to devise and implement a methodology that essentially maps the spread of those indicators into a series of letter grades. There are a few additional requirements there. we have requirements for the state board, specifically as it relates to that system of annual measurable objectives, where the board is required to both evaluate and approve the establishment of the objectives themselves, the goals, and those measures that feed those goals. There's also a series of federally required designations. So required by federal government to identify schools that are essentially priority schools, in addition to schools whose performance is particularly low for various subgroups, or our ATSI schools. So in terms of what needs to adjust now, in terms of the federal requirements themselves, there were 4 federal findings to which we're responding, and eventually I'll detail the solutions, but I wanted to start with what we had to accomplish first. First finding here is Tennessee must constrain the high school achievement indicator to a single math and ELA course for a cohort of students. So essentially that core academic indicator in our accountability system, the achievement indicator, presently, or rather historically, Tennessee's ESSA amendment, our ESSA plan, has allowed that high school proficiency rate to be based on 5 different assessments. It's based on English 1, English 2, and a 3-course progression in math. So typically students will take Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2. Any 5 of those assessments would actually be used to calculate a high school's percent proficient or achievement indicator. The finding that we're responding to is USED has come back and said that we can only use a single test of English and a single test of math to compute this achievement indicator. What USED is thinking here, and what happens in many other states that manage their assessment portfolio differently, is many states would administer what we might think of as a basic high school proficiency exam. It would typically be an exam administered in 11th grade. It would be based on 8th or 9th grade standards, and everybody takes it when they get to 11th grade. That is not how our assessment portfolio is organized. And so what I will eventually detail here is somewhat of what will feel like a mechanically cumbersome solution that the department has devised that will allow us to meet this obligation, that we will use a single test in ELA and a single test in math to compute this achievement indicator. The other relevant component of this finding is a cohort expectation. So essentially similar with that idea of having an 11th grade test, there is an expectation that every child will essentially have taken these tests at a particular point in time, and we will report all the students at that time as a cohort or as a bundle of students. And again, when we get to that point in the presentation, I'll detail the solution that we've devised in that space. It is more complicated, just given the structure of our assessment portfolio. Second finding to which we had to respond essentially is the idea that only assessments that have been proven to assess the depth and breadth of Tennessee state standards can be used to calculate that achievement indicator. Presently in Tennessee, we do have a policy in place where students that have essentially already completed the full course math progression before they reach 11th grade, our existing accountability system allows us to take a qualifying score on the ACT and factor that into the achievement indicator. USED has functionally said because the ACT has not been shown at this point in time to measure the depth and breadth of Tennessee state standards that we cannot use the ACT in the calculation of accountability. Or rather, I should say our achievement indicator, and by extension, our accountability system. Third finding here that we'll get to is a series of off-grade testing. So when we say off-grade testing, typically what we refer to is a child who is in middle school, but they are sufficiently advanced that it would be appropriate for them to begin to take our end of course exams or our high school exams. So the most common example of this might be an 8th grader that begins to take Algebra 1. What USED flagged for us is simply that our existing ESSA amendment communicated to the federal government a very limited set of off-grade level offerings that should be permissible within our accountability system. In fact, the only one we specified originally was Algebra 1 in 8th grade. USED flagged for us essentially an opportunity for us to come back and specify other forms of off-grade testing that should be permissible from an accountability perspective in Tennessee. So if you're particularly advanced and you want to start Algebra 1 in 7th grade, our present system would not allow that score to count. And really, truly, this is an accounting issue. We're going to submit a waiver to USED that will essentially specify more opportunities, and I'll detail what those opportunities are when we get to that point in the presentation. Purely an accounting issue here. The fourth and final finding to which we are responding is, and this one, there's a lot of nuance here and it's particularly important. The finding itself is that no child can be counted as a graduate in the federally reported graduation rate. Again, this is one of those indicators for which there are very specific federal requirements. They cannot be counted as a graduate if that child receives a regular diploma without having completed all the same required coursework as any other child that receives a regular diploma. Now again, the most important thing that we've ever said at any point in time with any of the engagement that we've ever done on this issue is the fact that US Ed has no jurisdiction on what diploma a child receives. That is not in question in any way, shape, or form as a result of this discussion. Graduation requirements are the purview of the state board, and this has no implication on that in any way, shape, or form. It does, however, limit potentially which students we can report to the federal government as graduates. So the only implication here is how the graduation rate is reported, not what diplomas are accessible to different populations of students. And I'll just put one point on this just to underscore the challenge that this poses. We do presently have in state board rule a graduation pathway by which a child with a few stipulations, they have to be a child who has an IEP, so it's a student identified for disability, specifically with additional support in math. There's a state board pathway that will lead to a regular diploma for that child if they essentially take 4 math courses, but never complete Algebra 2. So typically that progression, we often refer to these as the AB students. They'll take Algebra 1 spread over 2 years. They'll then take geometry spread over 2 years. They will have completed 4 math classes, but they will have not completed Algebra 2. And those are the students in particular that are causing the challenge that we face here. Those are the students that we cannot federally report as graduates, even though those children will receive a regular diploma. And there, again, there's no implication for those children. So these are the requirements themselves to which we have to respond. In terms of the progression of the conversation around this, we have been going back and forth with US Ed, trying to clarify the constraints to which we need to respond. I will say, and I'm happy to provide more context as I progress, a lot of our solutions are very different than perhaps the wording of the finding itself. We've been able to achieve a number of concessions from US Ed about how we actually will respond to this, but it's been an enormous amount of work on the department's part just to try to clarify what will satisfy US Ed's requirements in this space. So we've been working on that for quite a while. We specifically began engaging with directors across the state on these challenges and some preliminary solutions. So we intended regional meetings with every director across the state in October and November. In December, we convened the statewide assessment and accountability group to review the department's proposals for our new ESSA amendment. There was a public comment period in which we displayed for the public our solutions to these challenges from December 19th to January 9th. And the department has since processed all of that feedback, continued to respond to it to the greatest extent possible to take advantage of what we've learned from the field. Again, I'm happy to highlight some of the places where we have been able to improve our solutions based on feedback from directors and from the public. I do want to be very transparent with the board, however, that just given the very specific nature of some of these findings, in a lot of cases, there just were not a lot of options for the department in terms of how we needed to respond. And so we did try to be very transparent with the field. We didn't want to sort of pander to folks to ask for feedback where we knew we couldn't take it. And again, I'll try to detail that as we progress through this. But we did our best to strike the right balance of being as informative and transparent and engaging with the field as often as we could without sort of being disingenuous about where we had flexibility and truly where we didn't. So when we think about the solutions, I am happy to report that since we last spoke about this in December, we have continued to refine the solutions that we put in place. There are some improvements that we're happy to discuss or to share with you at this point in time. And so let's talk about the most challenging, just involved finding and solution. And this is the finding relative to which assessments can be used to calculate high school proficiency rates. The department's position on our solution for this is to constrain the assessments used in the accountability system to essentially either Algebra 1 or Integrated 1. And I'm happy to report English 2. Initially, this was an open question that the department was working with, whether or not we would be required to use the English 1 exam or the English 2 exam. There were some concessions that we needed to wring from USED on how students would be required to participate. There are some additional students with disabilities that aren't working toward the regular diploma, but ensuring that those students could be tested at the appropriate time in their course progression. We're happy to say that we've secured flexibility from USED in that regard, and so the department is presently prepared to propose that the 2 assessments that feed the accountability system moving forward will be either Integrated 1 or Algebra 1 and English 2. One additional refinement to the department's plan in this place relative to what we discussed last year. USED has been, and this is something we pushed back on strenuously, they have been adamant that it really does, their intent is 1 test of English language, or 1 test of mathematics. Presently, about 20% of the kids in the state are in Integrated 1 districts, which means instead of taking algebra, geometry, and algebra 2, they take Integrated 1, 2, or 3. The department's plan for meeting the federal requirement for these students has shifted. The first part of the plan remains the same. We have to secure a waiver from USED to give us permission to allow us to implement either Algebra 1 or Integrated 1 for this accountability cycle. There simply isn't time to put any solution in place. USED has indicated to us verbally in a variety of meetings, including just in January when we met again, that this is acceptable to them. What is different now is our solution for this moving forward. Previously, what I had communicated to the board was our best available thinking was to essentially identify the 82% of the standards that overlap between Algebra 1 and Integrated 1, and essentially just compute a performance level and a scale score for the standards that those 2 assessments, or those 2 courses had in common. We were referring to this last time we met as a 9th grade math test. It is not an elegant solution, and it further complicates what is already truly a rather complicated accountability system. The department was not particularly happy with that solution. What I'm happy to report now is that after working with our technical advisory committee, psychometric experts, additional psychometric experts with our testing provider and across the country, we believe there's an opportunity for us to take advantage of the new math standards that are just being implemented this year. That new standards implementation, not this summer, but next summer, will result in what is typically called a standard setting process. As part of the typical TCAP procedure, we will bring together an expert group of educators in those subject areas that have just implemented new standards and administered their first TCAP test. And that expert committee of educators will essentially assist the department in setting the scoring expectations for that new set of standards administered with what are likely very new TCAP tests. And particularly in mathematics, when there are a lot of new high school standards, that standard setting procedure is essential. What we now realize we have an opportunity to do is to augment the standard setting process in the summer of '24. And essentially, we'll bring the committees of teachers for Integrated 1 and Algebra 1 together. And as a concluding process of their existing standard setting activities, they will essentially align the scales for Algebra 1 and Integrated 1. We'll fundamentally be able to put the 2 math tests on the same scale. And so we'll have comparable scoring expectations for those 2 assessments moving forward. We're confident in this process. The department is happy to provide additional technical details. We're aware of a number of states that have successfully completed this process, and the psychometric evidence for their work, I think, is robust and sufficient. So this will not require us to produce a second set of scale scores and a second set of performance levels that was just going to muddy what will ultimately be. Last wrinkle here, and I think this is also speaks to the mechanical complexity of this change, and that is the cohort expectation. Again, USED is thinking, well, everybody takes the test in the same year. With our portfolio of assessments, and even with English 2 and Algebra 1, students take those in a variety of different years. And so we will end up having to batch together students in a cohort, but this is going to require us to essentially bank scores for different students in prior years and aggregate them together over a period of time before they're reported to to the federal government. This is not a solution that the department wanted to engage in any way, shape, or form, but it is the only viable solution that we have for meeting these requirements. So functionally, there would become 4 buckets of students that are tested at different times as a result of this process. The most typical progression would be a child who takes Algebra 1 or Integrated 1 in 9th grade, and they take English 2 in 10th grade. We are essentially functionally censusing the accountability system in 10th grade. So their English scores would be reported in 10th grade in the current year. Their math scores would essentially be delayed a year. So we would pick up that Algebra 1 score in 9th grade. We would hold on to it. And when they get to 10th grade, we will report both English and math for that child. Second bucket of the students would be students in advanced math. So if I start taking Algebra 1 in 7th grade or 8th grade, we have, and this is one of the concessions we've sort of wrung from US Ed, they have communicated to us clearly that they would, even though this is in violation of the finding, they would allow us to use any TCAP test that that child takes in 9th grade for the high school accountability indicator. So if that child starts Algebra 1 in 7th grade, they'll still have Algebra 2 in 9th grade. And it has been confirmed from us from US Ed that for those advanced students, we can take whatever TCAP test they take in their 9th grade year. And this is obviously critically important because holding a high school accountable for performance observed in the middle school is it's a non-starter. It just doesn't make sense. So we've been glad to say that there is a concession. That is essentially the second bucket of students. There are 2 additional buckets of students that exist, and these are students who have special needs. So the most relevant of which are students who actually take the alternative assessment. Historically, these students are always tested in 11th grade, and for these students and any other students with disabilities who have specific requirements or have historically been tested later in the progression, those students will be allowed to continue to test whenever they have previously, and we will report them in the current year. So our alt scores will continue to be administered in 11th grade, however, we will report them in the current year as if they were 10th graders. And again, I realize this is mechanistically complex. I'm happy to pause here and answer any questions that I have. Please feel free to interrupt me at any point.
The only thing that I'm going to say at this point, are we getting all of these concessions that the department is making, and I'm not talking about TDOE, U.S. Department, in writing, so that, change in administration and down the line, something was approved and now it's not, and then we're back in the same situation where we're out of compliance with a new.
Absolutely. And I think that I really appreciate the question, and it is so particularly relevant because almost every single one of these findings here was actually stipulated in our existing ESSA state plan. And we've been operating under that state plan for a number of years. So I do think the point is incredibly well taken. The department has been proactive in this space. We were guardedly optimistic, but perhaps foolishly so. We've provided a full set of our solutions in writing to US Ed. We had asked for preliminary approval, and we were hopeful that we could share preliminary approval for these findings. However, I will say we did meet in middle January with US Ed. We talked through every single one of those findings, and all of the indications in the room was that our solutions are acceptable. However, we do not yet have preliminary approval to share with the board at this time.
I'm sure. So you do get that in writing that these are the concessions?
We've asked for it.
But you have not gotten it yet?
We have not yet gotten that.
Okay.
We have not yet gotten that in writing.
Okay.
I will say the rough structure of these solutions has been discussed at length.
So when does that occur, just for your own covering, I guess, even the department's covering? Because if you don't have it in writing, then you really don't have it. I mean, it would be my sort of my concern. So when is that going to be like, hey, this is a concession they're letting us have and they mean it? Like, when do you get that?
Technically, nobody will get that until their official ESSA state amendment plan is approved.
Okay.
What we were hoping to do is to get preliminary approval of our design so that we could submit it with more assurance that it is in fact going to be approved. Simply because the timeline, to your point, I think, is that the timeline simply doesn't allow for US Ed to spend however many weeks it requires to review our official ESSA amendment and then come back and tell us it's inappropriate. So we are, and we had hoped to receive preliminary written approval by this meeting, I would expect that we would receive that within a week or two, prior to actually officially submitting our SM amendment.
And just, could we request as a board that when you all do get that approval, that we could just
Absolutely,
have a copy of that? Thank you.
of course, happy to. Okay, so moving on from this solution, the second finding here is essentially the removal of the ACT substitution practice, and this is something that, again, Tennessee has historically done, where advanced students are allowed to use ACT qualifying scores in the accountability system if they reach 8th grade and no longer have a TCAP test. There is no fork in the road here. The department simply has to discontinue this process, and we've been very forthcoming with the field that this will have a negative downward impact on accountability rates, or rather proficiency rates, but there's simply nothing else for the department to do on this timeline. There are additional adjustments that the department will entertain at a later date, larger structural changes to our assessment portfolio that could be discussed and considered, but simply are not possible on this timeline.
Why will this have a downward adjustment?
Because generally speaking, students that have completed Algebra 2 by 10th grade generally do well on the ACT.
But I
So-
would assume if they've completed Algebra 2 by 10th grade, they did well in Algebra 2.
Because the ACT standards are generally speaking far below Algebra 2. So it's content that they'll do particularly well on. They almost always do better.
So if the content is lower, I can understand why the feds then said, we're not going to let you use it.
Okay, so in terms of off-grade testing, this one again is mechanically simple for us. US Ed has not stipulated, and matter of fact, they're not even asking the department to stipulate what forms of off-grade testing should be managed in Tennessee. They're simply allowing us or requiring the department to set guardrails for what could be permissible in Tennessee. So the department wants to be clear here. We're not advocating that these is the appropriate form of off-grade testing that districts ought to be using, but we are simply trying to say, if you engage in these forms of off-grade testing, we can take those scores and we can use them in the accountability system. Anything else that you choose to do beyond this scope, those scores would actually be exempt from the accountability system. And essentially the department's approach to this was to survey districts to try to get as much feedback as possible. However, there is sort of a mechanistic requirement here as well, and that gets back to that issue of needing to have a TCAP test in 9th grade to preserve the integrity of high school accountability. So essentially where we're setting the levels for permissible off-grade testing is to say, as long as essentially you can start end of course exams in middle school as early as possible, as long as there's still a TCAP test for you to take in 9th grade. So for math, that means you can start high school end of course exams in 7th grade. I'll still have integrated 3, or I'll still have algebra 2 to factor into high school accountability. With English, because we only have a 2-course progression and we need English 2, you can start English 1 in 8th grade, and I'll still have an English 2 score to compute accountability. Again, we never want accountability to become the tail that wags the dog. The department's guidance in anything related to accountability is do what's best for kids all the time. However, we do want to be transparent with people about what those accountability implications will be. Additionally, we've also written into our proposal that there may be alternative forms of within middle school off-grade testing. So if you have a truly academically precocious 6th grader and you don't want to administer Algebra 1 to that child, you could use the 8th grade exam for that 6th grade student. So again, we're just trying to give districts as much flexibility to meet students' needs and still stay, or rather still maintain an accountability system that recognizes their good work. And then lastly, well, my slides aren't advancing, but as you might imagine, I know this stuff by heart at this point. So the fourth and final finding is the finding relative to graduation rate. And again, the issue here is that any child that receives a regular diploma without, in our purposes in Tennessee, having completed Algebra 2, that child will continue as long as they meet all the other requirements to receive the regular diploma, but we can't count them as a graduate. We've modeled this out. We've shared the data on this with districts about the potential impact of this. This is another issue where there is nothing but a downward trend on graduation rate. We're only talking about students that are being removed with no additional students added. So we don't want to make, we want to recognize the significance of it. However, this is another instance where without essentially looking back at changing graduation policy, there is no adjustment here for the department that we could make to bring our existing graduation rate calculation into alignment with federal expectations. The department is committed to a couple adjustments here. We do have to report graduation rate in our school report card every year in consultation with districts. One of the things that we're committed to is essentially reporting to accountability rates in our report card moving forward. We'll report the Tennessee graduation rate, which we'll continue to calculate as we always have. We will also indicate the federally reported graduation rate. Again, I do want to be transparent. It is the federally reported graduation rate that will feed the accountability system. However, we feel like it is important longitudinal context that folks know what actually is the appropriate way to look at changes in graduation rate over time. And meeting this finding is essentially changing the accounting without changing the experience of students in schools. We realize there are some downsides. It may be a little confusing to now suddenly have two graduation rates, but we do feel like it is an effective and responsible adjustment for us to make. And we'll work on trying to communicate that as clearly as possible. So in terms of the feedback that we've received in public comment, I do want to say, again, in the interest of transparency, we did not receive a ton of feedback, but I think to a great extent that is somewhat reasonable because truly we did not have a lot of forks in the road. There were not a lot of options for us. The ELA and math test was probably the only place where we did have some meaningful opportunities to turn left or right. For the vast majority of these other findings, there really were not a lot of other options available to us. So we did hear a number of, I think, very valid and important concerns. However, the findings that we did receive for the public record, fortunately, very few of those were particularly actionable to us. I think if there is a theme in those findings, probably the one that was referenced most strongly was the concern about not having high school accountability be based on high school performance. A number of those comments were concerned about, well, if I test my child with Algebra 1 in 8th grade, do they suddenly not count for high school accountability? And I'm pleased to report that we do have a concession from USED that those students will in fact count, that we can use geometry, we can use Algebra 2 in that instance.
But we don't have that in writing yet.
But we don't have that.
All right. Okay. So we hope we get it.
Absolutely. And the point is exceedingly well taken.
All right.
Yes, it's exceedingly well taken. So in terms of next steps, we have submitted preliminary findings. As soon as we have any form of tacit confirmation that that essentially we have in writing the same thing that we have been hearing from USED for a number of months. We will communicate that back to the board. We will then officially submit our amendment. The department has done all of the legwork that we possibly can to prepare to both release the accountability protocol the second that amendment is confirmed, and also we are working to be as prepared as we possibly can to bring AMOs to the board. Because the AMOs are based on the achievement indicator in particular, we cannot calculate official AMOs until these findings are approved. I will say there's one additional wrinkle there that we're grappling with for the calculation of the graduation rate. And this is an issue that we have been working on for some time now. The existing data model, the existing state data warehouse does not presently have all of the information that the department would need to essentially unilaterally make the change that we discussed to graduation rate. The state data warehouse does not presently receive transcript data. So which child has received essentially high school graduation credit for which courses. It's not something we have in the data warehouse, and it would be something that we would need to officially calculate grad rate in accordance with USED findings. I just want to flag the department's plan in the near term. We have a verification process ongoing with districts right now. So we've taken the best available information that we have about who are these students that might be exempt from graduation rate. We are communicating that information to districts, and we are giving districts opportunities to submit to us more information about those students so that we can get those numbers correct. In future iterations of this, we will make adjustments to the state data warehouse to allow the department to capture that information and calculate it for districts. But it was a requirement for us to engage in this data verification process at this time. That process has not yet completed. Districts are still looking at that data. It will take us just a few more weeks to give districts ample time to ensure that that data is accurate. And of course, we can't finalize the AMOs until that data is verified. So we had sort of aspirationally hoped that we have the AMOs to the board in March. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about our ability to meet March. And the only reason for that is the actual data verification process and ensuring we've given districts ample time to ensure we have the right information to calculate this. And so with that said, that's where we are and our final set of solutions for this process. And I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Thank you, Dr. Laird. Are there questions or comments? Mr. Eby?
Thank you, very informative. As I recall, they got our attention on this by claiming they were going to withhold $500 million if we didn't have this done in a period of time. Have they withheld any funds yet, or is there a point in time that this has to be approved by that before we'd get the funds? Or
to my knowledge, they have not withheld any funds at this point in time. But I will say the department, and I'm happy to lean on other folks, the folks in the department with more experience engaging with USAID than I felt that that warning really needed to be taken seriously. So to answer your question, it has not occurred yet, and I'm happy to provide a link. We put a number of the communications that we've received from USAID on the website for the public to see, and there is a very sternly worded letter on that website. So the department really is taking the threat of this seriously, but at this point in time, that has not occurred.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? I want to say this publicly. Dr. Laird, I think they hired the right man for the job. Seriously, every time you present, I think you make it as clear as possible for us to understand and how complex it is and the hoops that you all have had to jump through. But I'm delighted that you're in this role, that you've taken up the mantle and you stand before us to present this very complex information. So thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We are going to take a 10-minute break. We'll reconvene at 2:55. We still have 3 more presentations. So I apologize for the delay, but we'll try to get back on track. Thank you.
There is just 2.
short circuit or not provide enough time for each meaningful presentation. So next up is Mr. Charlie Bufalino from the department on TISA rules. TISA rules, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice, and I'm not talking as much as our presenters. Anyway, let's move forward. Even though we're missing some people. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Do you want me to begin now, or?
Let's wait a moment.
Okay.
We're missing 3 people?
Do you have a quorum? Good.
3. We're starting the meeting, gentlemen, board members. Mr. Mullenhour and Mr. Holt, we are returning to session. Crack that whip. Because we're so behind, I'm trying to keep us on track when I can, but it's not so easy. I think we can go ahead and get started because Mr. Holt is in the room and we're missing Mr. Morrow, but go ahead and get started.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Charlie Bufalino, Assistant Commissioner of Policy and Legislative Affairs with the Department of Education. And I'm here today to give you a brief presentation and overview of some proposed revisions to our TISA rules, specifically the outcomes bonuses rule and a couple correlated changes in the definition section. I went backwards. Sorry about that. So just to give a brief overview or sort of a reminder of what is required under the law. So TISA, subject to the legislature's appropriations process, requires us at the department to allocate student-generated outcome incentive dollars to school districts based on the achievement of their students. And the law does not spell out specifically what those outcome bonus goals are, but rather requires the Commissioner of Education to convene an outcomes review committee to develop proposed recommendations to the outcome goals, a process which I know, Madam Chair Lady, you participated in earlier this summer with the original rules. So just to give you kind of a little overview of the timeline to get us up to speed where we are today, all of the TISA rules, including the outcome rules, received a positive recommendation from this body on August 11th at our special called meeting. We then just recently, actually last week, received a positive recommendation from the Joint Government Operations Committee of the General Assembly. And so those rules are set to go into effect on February 15th. Any adjustments made to the rule, including the ones we're proposing here today, will have to again go through that full rulemaking process, just as the original rules did. And with these changes, there is enough time for these rules to go into effect for next school year. So to talk a little bit about the revisions process.
Excuse me, I just have one.
Yes, sir.
You said that all the rules received a positive recommendation at the August meeting. I was under the impression, maybe I forgot, that the outcomes, the CTE and were 2 that were waiting, that we didn't. Did we vote on those? Did we give those a positive recommendation?
I can answer that question.
Okay.
You did, sir. So all of the 14 different rule sections received positive recommendations. CTE is another area where there has continued to be some additional feedback, and there likely will be some rule revisions that we will plan to bring to the board at a later date. And then outcomes is sort of that other area. And again, this was sort of by design, I think, in terms of how the law was structured. In certain areas, it's always easier to amend rules and faster than changing a law and things of that nature. So the General Assembly, I think, fairly intentionally left some of these areas open for rulemaking, particularly because they're likely to change over time. And as we've talked about before, one of the major benefits of TISA when compared to the BEP is it is a formula that is simpler to understand, more transparent, and also easier to change as we learn more over time and want to continue to have as effective as a formula as possible for raising student achievement. So to hop back into this here, so almost immediately, we continued to receive additional feedback on some of those outcomes rules from other groups, and this was certainly an area where we received quite a bit of public comment on the original ones. And so because of that, the commissioner wanted to reconvene that outcomes review committee to sort of discuss or open up the possibility of, hey, do we want to look at these again already and possibly make some changes? And that occurred on December 15th when that group was pulled together, and that outcomes review committee did agree that we should pursue some changes here that we'll go over here in a little bit, and sort of directed us to sort of begin that process and take us up to where we are today. So of those changes in the outcomes rules, it's really all focused just on the high school outcome section. We're not changing the elementary and middle school outcomes really at all. And so before we get into some of the changes, I want to just kind of review where the current rule is on those high school outcomes. So currently, students would generate an outcomes bonus if they had an ACT score of 21 or an improvement of 4 points on their ACT, the first one in the sort of retake, or earn a Tier 2 or Tier 3 industry credential. And then there's a component at the end of that part of the rule that says if there are any leftover funds, those would then be allocated using a Ready Graduate indicator. And that was kind of put in there because some of the feedback we were getting at the time was, you know, should we just use Ready Graduate indicator? Do we want to sort of have that be sort of more elevated here? And so at the time, that was kind of the compromise to put it in there. Some of the feedback we've gotten since then, as I kind of was just discussing, there were some concerns of lack of alignment or not full alignment to the current accountability system. And that's really where I think a lot of that Ready Graduate feedback came. In certain areas, folks thought it wasn't rigorous enough. These are student outcome incentive bonuses. These are not meant to be every school in the state is going to earn these, and they're not meant to be designed that way. And so we got some feedback pushing us in certain areas to be a little bit more rigorous there. And also that area I just talked about the leftover funds was, I think a lot of folks said rightly, was somewhat complicated. Why not sort of build this into the actual thing and not have a let's do everything and then deal with some leftover funds? It would be cleaner to do it differently. So some of these proposed revisions, as I said, this is really about adjusting the high school outcome bonus criteria to be a student within a graduating class who met any of the following criteria. So earned an EPSO early post-secondary opportunity credit in at least 2 EPSOs and either a 21 plus on the ACT or that improved by 4 points on the ACT. Or a student who earned an EPSO credit for 3 EPSOs, or a student who scored a 31 plus on the ASVAB / AFQT assessment, that's the military sort of readiness version assessment that's there, and earn an EPSO credit in at least 2 EPSOs. So, and then also we had a corresponding change in the definition section of the rule to add a definition for EPSO credit, meaning the completion of an EPSO that results in either post-secondary credits or clock hours, a passing score on those approved exams, or a Tier 2 or Tier 3 industry credential as defined by the department. And then I'll just mention we did not change any of the percentage weights as part of this, so those remain the same at those 10% or 20% levels for economically disadvantaged students, EL students, et cetera. So just one note on that EPSO credit. So this is really an attempt to build in what our Ready Graduate indicator is to be more of a part of this, right? That's why we're using that definition and including and adding that to part of the outcomes that could be raised. And also we're raising the bar in terms of the number of EPSOs that you would have to have in order to generate this. Additionally, just a couple of other revisions, more tech.
Charlie,
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, before you move on, in the chapter definition of the EPSO credit, we talk about clock hours.
Mhm.
I think I asked the question of Robin the other day. We're referring to TCAT clock hours or some other form of clock hours.
So generally, currently, where we stand today, it's TCAT clock hours, but there is the possibility in the future of other providers, maybe a public-private partnership that's not currently in existence that might come into play later on. And we spoke to some of our program folks, and clock hours is sort of a understood kind of term in these sort of areas. you're not seeing it say TCAT clock hours in the rule to allow some flexibility if there are other ones that would meet that definition or that eligibility in the future.
Yeah, because I mean, I made the assumption it's TCAT, and maybe everybody else in the universe of Tennessee education understands that, so I was not sure that it was clear enough. But you explained it here, but I don't know about out in the field, how clear it will be to others.
And the only other thing I would say on that front is that might be a good opportunity for us to clarify some of that in guidance, right? You know, not lock ourselves in the rule, but to clarify in guidance of what those different things are. And we do still have the TISA guide coming, and that's certainly an area we can look to articulate in that document. Yes,
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yes.
Just a question on the either a 21 plus on the ACT or improved by 4 points on the ACT. Is there a bottom threshold there, or is it just no matter what you got first, you get 4 more points and you're good to go? So like you could get a 14, get 4, get an 18, and then that suffices, or is there a minimum score you would have to get?
That's a great question. Under the current version of the rule, there's not a minimum score. You know, if you look at some of the data, a 4-point improvement is quite large, and that is not a super common occurrence. And I have some data towards the end of the presentation that will give some kind of universe of students with some of these criteria that might give you a little bit of a sense of that. But to answer your question, no, there isn't a minimum.
Do we have a concern then, students who say get that 4 points, never make it to the 21 threshold, when that's also in the goal? Like, it seems a little bit conflicting that you have the 21 or the 4 points.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm thinking back into sort of previous discussions with the review committee and even public comment, and I actually don't think I have seen or heard that raised currently. I think it's a fair point, right? And we've talked a lot with this body about the difference between achievement and growth. In the last presentation, we heard some discussion of that certainly as well. We did receive a lot of feedback, I think, in the initial draft of the rules that was released on June 6th of last year. We didn't have a growth impact, and we got a lot of feedback asking for one. And, you know, the other element here is we want students to take that assessment twice, and the state pays for it as well, and all of those reasons I think there was a desire. But I don't actually think there's been a conversation about setting a floor to date.
Just because, you know, even if you just pick 17, so then you can get 4 points, or you hit the 21 or 60, just something that would give some consistency between the two numbers that you choose.
Yeah, that's certainly something I can share back with our folks.
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
I have a similar question about the clock hours. So I see in the episode credit definition that it can be either the clock hours or post-secondary credit, a passing score on one of the exams, or a tier 2 or tier 3 industry credential. Are all of those things defined somewhere or well understood, or will get explained in guidance? Or what it means to get, you know, a quote passing score on one of the exams? And then the post-secondary credit, is that they actually matriculate to a post-secondary institution and receive like a credit hour?
Yeah, it is. And it's really about completion of it. That's really what we're getting at. And to answer the first part, yes, guidance will sort of spell all of that out. And the passing score on exam is sort of intentionally not defined because it's going to depend on the exam. We essentially say, so an easy example is the advanced placement. So they define a 3 as a passing score, but that is not the same metric as for an inner baccalaureate course or something else. So we essentially say whatever that exam is that is currently qualifies an EPSO under our accountability system, whatever your definition is of passing is what we recognize as passing here. Does that make sense?
It does. And then for the tier 2 and tier 3 industry credentials, are those already listed somewhere, or is that something that would?
I believe they are already listed somewhere. Yes, they are.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, and for students who maybe start out in one school and finish, they did 2 EPSO credits in one school and 1 in another, I presume the bonus would go to the final school they were associated with, or how's that work?
It would depend on the timing of when the transition would. We actually have, I believe it's in rule, some existing stipulations about who gets credit for a student for accountability purposes, specifically to avoid scenarios in which, you know, maybe a student transfers to another school 1 week before testing begins or something like that. So I think we have those sort of existing parameters that we could use in this application here. Okay, I will continue on, but please interrupt with additional questions when you have them. So just to talk through some of the other proposed revisions, a little bit more technical in nature, there's a clarification in there that the high school outcomes bonus are awarded to graduating high school students and only once. That was always sort of the intent and what was discussed with the Outcomes Review Committee, but we felt that could be made clearer, and so when we were opening this up, we chose to clarify that as well. And then we also had some revisions to the outcome bonus criteria for high school students with disabilities, so that if there was a student who was not already generating an outcome bonus in those categories, if they were enrolled in a school district that meets Indicator 5 of the State Annual Performance Report, which is what we're using for this section of the metrics, and meets 2 out of the 3 other indicators specified in the rule, they could sort of achieve that as well. And that Indicator 5 is essentially students who receive instruction 80% of the day in the general education classroom. So it's somewhat of a measure or a proxy or incentive for serving students in the least restricted environment. And then finally, we specified, based on some of the feedback we had and the fact that this is going to be an evolving area, and we're going to see sort of what makes sense and probably be looking at this again in future years, but we specified in the rule itself that the department will conduct a pilot program in this upcoming school year, 23-24, related to post-high school success metrics to determine potential revisions. So we discussed this a little bit, I think, at the August meeting, but there was some feedback and public comment about, the real sort of success here is not those measures that you graduate at the end of high school, but what are you sort of doing after it? We don't necessarily track all of maybe what some of those potential metrics could be. So I think this is an opportunity for us to think through that and pilot how that could look going forward, because we certainly agreed with that feedback that we want to get at those post-secondary sort of achievement success metrics as well as just what we're seeing at the end of the high school portion of a student's trajectory. And then finally, I had mentioned just wanting to share a little bit of data on kind of the current lay of the land with some of these metrics and what we're seeing our students achieve. So for that HIT 21 plus on the ACT, among the 2022 graduating cohort of students in Tennessee, there were 71,000 students in the cohort, and 64,580 of those graduated on time. And of that universe, there were 22,466 students who hit the 21 plus on ACT, or 34.8% of the one-time graduates beating the benchmark. So that gives you an example of the rigor, the success rate of sort of what we're talking about with that metric being included. And then for the GRU 4 points between the initial ACT and ACT retake, among that same number of 2022 graduating cohort, there were 3,172 students who grew at least 4 points. So I think to Mr. Morrow's point, that is not a particularly large group of students who are seeing actualize that. I would characterize that as a pretty rigorous, lofty goal in terms of seeing that. And then for earned a Tier 2 or Tier 3 industry credential, in the 21-22 school year, 3,910 students earned a Tier 2 or Tier 3 industry credential. Again, that denominator of the graduating cohort is the same I've been referencing. And then finally, the number of students who met the Ready Graduate Indicator, which is really what we're getting at with those new high school outcome metrics. The number of Ready Graduate students in 2021 was 28,327, or 39.7% of that graduating cohort. And in 2022, it was 29,549, or 41.1% of that graduating cohort. So I'm hopeful that some of these statistics give you a sense of what we're potentially looking at going into this going forward, of the number of students and by extension schools and districts that would be generating some of these outcome bonuses. And I know we will have the rule sort of before you tomorrow, but I'm happy to take any additional questions that members have.
Yes, Mr. Darnell.
Charlie, I know you mentioned the possibility of an additional rule, possibly CTE changing. So think from a district level, budgeting is beginning. So, my concern would be, how quickly is that going to finish? How quickly would it be brought to us? Because, as districts plan, waiting on the state to kind of finalize that budget and then move from there. So can you give some feedback or direction on that?
No, thank you for that. And that's a very insightful and very important question. And just, for broader context aside, even from this rule, as I mentioned, the existing rules are going to affect next week in terms of being official. We have been working rigorously with our districts to verify the data they're sending back to us. We are likely going to have those initial teaser projections to districts, by the end of the month or right around then, which is, as you probably know in your capacity, is months earlier than we've ever been able to do with the BEP, which the first of those never went out until the end of April. And that is, again, a design feature of TISA and something we want to do. But to get to your point sort of more directly, I think right now it is highly likely that if there were any changes that came with the CTE rules, they would not come for this upcoming school year, but a future school year. And we have had some tremendous discussions with the working group we kind of pulled together, identified a lot of areas for opportunity. I think we were excited about what those can be and bringing those new changes, but we also want to make sure we get every element of that right too. And I think that predictability is going to be important, particularly in year one, to your point.
Yes, Mr. Holt.
Charlie, in past meetings, we've talked about the department creating the TISA manual, and I was curious kind of what the status of that is and when you anticipate that being ready for districts.
We are working on it currently. I don't know if we have an exact ETA right now of when it's going to hit the street, so to speak, but I can check on that and get back to you, but it's an active development as we speak.
Okay. And a question on the data. The data is helpful and interesting. Do you have a sense of the proposed change with the outcome rule, if this is going to result in fewer students that would qualify? Is that the expectation versus what initially was approved?
Yes, I don't have an exact breakdown on fewer, but yes, this based on sort of the feedback we had in this specific area, I think there will be fewer students that qualify than under the current rules.
And the change is only to the high school.
Correct.
Rule. So for elementary, middle, it remains the same?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Eby.
So year one starts this fall, is that correct?
Year one of TISA?
Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
2023-24 school year is year one.
So if the rules that got passed last year are implemented, and I'm thinking CTE, and you're saying CTE will not likely be changed this year, it would be next year. So it would be implemented this fall with the existing CTE rule, is that correct?
That is correct, but I would like, because I think you bring up a broader point that's worth underscoring again, TISA, with an exception for public charter schools, is based on prior year data. And so there is still a sense of urgency of going through that process with CTE rules if there are going to be changes, because what is happening in this school year right now is what generates the dollars in 23-24, and what happens in the 23-24 school year will generate 24-25, et cetera. So it is still important for that process to proceed expediently, because what you're doing now is generating what your dollars are going to be next year.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I guess my concern is if it's getting implemented with the existing rule that's there, that appears to me, at least, from the conversations we've had before, there's some significant changes coming forth. Is it being implemented in rules that will have unintended consequences that has an impact, I think?
Yeah, and I think I get what your question is. So in some respects, and I don't mean to be glib, but if we make any changes to TISA, we are always going to face that to a certain extent. And I think it behooves us as a department to communicate that clearly to districts, that they know when it's going to change, that they know why it's going to change, so that they can plan accordingly and know when that shift is going to happen. There are changes coming. We think we sort of want to see those. That doesn't mean that the current rules are wildly off base or ones we wish we sort of wouldn't have brought forward or anything like that. It's just continuous improvement, and we want to continue on that pathway. But I think the key, or what we need to be held accountable to, is our ability to communicate that effectively with folks who will be affected by it.
Other questions or comments? Okay. Hearing none, we can move on to the next topic unless, is there anything else you wanted to share with us, Mr. Bufalino?
No, thank you again for this board's engagement on TISA has been very impressive. You know, I think we said at the time, it certainly does not stop with the passage of the law or the passage of rules. You know, this continues to be one of the most important things, if not the most important initiative for us as a state, for our students, and we appreciate the insightful questions, your engagement, and your partnership on TISA moving forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We appreciate you being here to present. Okay, the next item is candidate assessment and licensure. Mr. Michael Durline. I think your microphone is off.
There we go. Good afternoon. Michael Durline, Deputy Executive Director, Policy and Research at the State Board. We're going to spend a little time talking about candidate assessment and licensure, so looking at some of the proposed revisions that you all voted on back in October, some feedback that we've received since that date, and some revisions we've made to our recommendations as a result of that feedback. We will also spend a little time talking about our plans for a holistic review of licensure in Tennessee, recognizing there have been a lot of changes over the last few years, and it's now time to kind of take a look at that system and determine whether it's best serving our educators and schools. And then we'll also have a little time for question and answer. So this graphic is intended to represent both the sort of inputs and outputs that have influence on candidate preparedness. So those blue items are those knowledge and skills for which EPPs in the state assess readiness. So content knowledge, so regarding the subject matter that an educator will teach. Pedagogical content knowledge and skills, so the intersection of that content knowledge and how they teach that content knowledge. So looking at things like organization of content matter to ensure relevancy, presentation of content, development of content standards aligned goals, etc. That last blue item there is pedagogical knowledge and skills, so the ability to deliver effective instruction irrespective of subject matter. And then down on the bottom, the red items, the inputs, are things that are expected of teacher candidates that support their readiness to be in the classroom. So looking at coursework, deep clinical practice, and engagement with a clinical mentor. Many of these things have state board rules and policies associated with them. One example are the requirements to serve as a clinical mentor include experience requirements and evaluation requirements. Looking specifically at content knowledge assessments, content assessments include those typically developed by ETS, or Educational Testing Services, also known as the Praxis assessments. National Evaluation Series, which is a branch of Pearson, and Alta Language Services. These assessments are typically developed using the same national standards that EPPs are expected to align their programs to. And many pathways to licensure in Tennessee require completion of those assessments, some up front to get a license and some to maintain a license, to renew or advance a license. There are a few pathways that do not require assessments, such as out-of-state pro-to-pro, as we have called it before, if you hold a professional license in another state. And job embedded doesn't require content assessments up front if you hold a major in the content area. This outlines specifically the Tennessee pathways to licensure, trying to simplify what is quite a bit of information and a lot of different pathways to licensure, a lot of different ways you can get in the classroom. But just looking at content knowledge assessments and the two pathways that we have, traditional undergraduate or post-bac pathways, so these are people who are completing preparation programs and then going into the classroom, versus those in a post-bac job-embedded pathway, so these are people who are demonstrating they have the content knowledge up front, enrolling in a program, completing coursework while they are serving as teacher of record. So this is current policy right now. So you can see the requirement to obtain a license varies a little bit. Job-embedded folks have the ability to get a license based on a major in the content area. But ultimately, everyone has to submit qualifying scores on content assessments. this is the proposal we brought before you in October, and that was to drop the requirement for content knowledge assessments, specifically for job-embedded educators who demonstrated a major in their content area. And the proposal was to drop that beginning September 1st, 2023. Feedback that we've received to date. Surprisingly, we've received very few comments on the content knowledge proposal. Folks were a little more interested in the second half of what I'll present around the EdTPA. Some EPPs expressed a desire to see this proposal expand to include undergraduate programs. So there are some teacher preparation undergraduate programs that result in a content area major and are approved for licensure. It is somewhat rare though. Some EPPs expressed a concern about majors that may not be a direct correlation, so such as elementary education, special education, early childhood education, and majors that are offered through the College of Education, such as secondary history education as opposed to history. Representatives from the Metropolitan Area School Systems Group were generally in support of this proposal. Tennessee Association of Colleges of Teacher Education did not actually provide feedback on this aspect of the proposal. I also got to speak with this lovely group of folks a few months back and appreciated their feedback on this recommendation as well. So tomorrow you will vote on this proposal, and we have made some shifts to it. So I wanted to highlight those shifts. You'll see that in the traditional undergraduate and post-bac pathway, we are proposing to add a pathway that would allow someone in those programs to obtain a license based on a major in the content area for select endorsement areas. And this lives in the professional assessments policy, so you'll see we've bolded some of those assessments and endorsements. This was based on feedback suggesting, hey, if somebody has a major and can go the job embedded route without having to take praxis, what about those in undergraduate programs? And then over on the right-hand side for job-embedded individuals, we are kind of limiting the endorsements again to a select few, considering the fact that some of the majors may not correlate as easily. And then on the very bottom, you'll see that we're proposing to pull back the implementation date to June, from September to June. Lots of feedback on that, suggesting that we should bring the implementation up so that more folks would qualify over the summer. Please feel free to stop me, by the way, if you have any questions.
Turn my microphone off. Michael, I just want to have clarity here. Because, you know, we've had conversations and there's been confusion about even interpreting this language. Mm-hmm. So current job-embedded candidates who are now taking their course for taking EdTPA, they're not going to have to take EdTPA if we pass this tomorrow.
Yeah, this portion of it is specifically about the content praxis assessment, so I'll get to that slide in a moment.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. I think there could be confusion around this too, and that's why I tried to orient this slide so that it's clear. That middle column is requirement to obtain a license. The third column is requirement to renew or advance the license. I think it's helpful to think about it in terms of when the educator is submitting the transaction, either to get a license or keep a license or advance a license.
Michael, I have a question.
Yeah.
And this chart, these slides are very helpful for me to kind of understand the landscape here. I appreciate them. I'm trying to understand, are we proposing in the February proposal to add back the requiring qualifying scores on content assessments that was
for job embedded?
For job embedded.
Yeah, I'm glad you called that out. I meant to mention this. So the reason we have that in this slide is because the initial proposal essentially dropped it for everyone. And because some people may get a license through a job embedded pathway in a major that is not a qualifying major to be exempt from having to take the praxis, they may still have to do it. And so we've kind of left that there. You know, I'm thinking about, early childhood, elementary, special education, ESL, even business education. We may want to revisit that in the future and figure out if there are pathways that would make sense there, but that's why we've left that up there.
So what would that, who would fall into that category where they're in the job embedded pathway.
Yep.
If they have a major in the content area, then they wouldn't have to do the praxis for renewing the license. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in the professional assessments policy, what you'll see is we've bolded all of those that would be considered qualifying endorsements and majors. It's primarily middle and secondary core content areas, so history, science, English, mathematics, and also world languages. We did get some feedback from folks that that's pretty clear, right? If somebody's a Spanish major, then maybe they don't need to take the praxis exam to renew their license.
And what's the rationale behind requiring the praxis for certain people who are outside of those categories?
I think for some, for example, early childhood, elementary education, special education, those majors are typically education-based programs. They're not as easy to correlate and say they have their content knowledge satisfied through that major. It's a little different. There are others, though, thinking about business education, and I can't think of any others off the top of my head that we may want to revisit. But I think we wanted to kind of start slow with this, to be honest, and see if we could look at the impact.
Just to jump in, I think those are great questions, Mr. Holt, and we've had a lot of discussion at the staff level. Part of the challenge, and Michael knows this from his prior job, is going to be the implementation of this policy too. If there's not a direct correlation, then it's going to set the department up for a lot of gray area in terms of the discretion that they would need to make about, does that content major align with the praxis that you're exempt from. So I think as Michael's going to end, there's a lot more that I want to talk about with this board and with our stakeholders about where we can go with licensure. This feels sort of like the first reasonable step to take in terms of where content majors could satisfy that content requirement in our current regs. Not to say there's not more we might explore here.
And I'm glad to hear that. And what do we all envision the process is going to look like for us to kind of work through this, where we are now, to a broader kind of re-envisioning of what licensure could look like?
I don't want to steal Michael's thunder because I know he's going to conclude with
No,
that,
go
but
for
we've
it.
been giving a lot of discussion to that very idea, and even this morning talking with folks at the department. I mean, I think it's going to be over the next 6 to 12 months that we would make a concerted effort as a board with some additional assistance that we might pull in to do a holistic review of current licensure in Tennessee, also nationally. What are the trends? What are the problems we're trying to solve? How can we create more coherence across these various pathways? Because part of what we're struggling with right now is that we do have, as Mr. Morrow said earlier, a lot of different sort of paths and exemptions for different types of candidates, which is not ideal. So it'll be a big lift. I'm going to let Michael get to it here in a minute, but we can talk more offline too.
Great, thank you.
Okay, shifting to pedagogical assessments. So pedagogical assessments include those developed by ETS, so the Praxis Principles of Learning and Teaching exam, which used to be the primary pedagogical assessment used for all prospective teachers. It's now mostly used for occupational teachers. And then the Pearson EdTPA assessment, which is used for essentially all academic teacher content areas. The PLT assessment, well, I guess I already said that. The EdTPA has been a requirement in Tennessee since 2019 for those completing a Tennessee-approved program in an academic licensure area. Many EPPs had used EdTPA prior to that. And there were about 8 EPPs in Tennessee that started using EdTPA, I believe, around 2010. So there's actually a pretty strong foundation for EdTPA in the state. EdTPA is a performance-based, subject-specific portfolio assessment. So it's not a sit down and do a multiple choice assessment. It is a rigorous performance-based assessment that's typically done over the course of a semester or a year during clinical practice. It requires a whole lot of coordination between the candidate, EPPs, clinical mentors, and clinical supervisors to complete that assessment and submit. So this, again, outlines the current policy for assessment of pedagogical knowledge and skill. Again, these rows represent different pathways. On these slides, I've added the clinical practice piece because I think that's important because that's where the EdTPA really takes place. So for traditional undergraduate or post-bac pathways that have a student teaching or an internship clinical practice, they are required to submit qualifying scores on the EdTPA or the PLT upfront, so in order to get a license. For those in post-bac job-embedded pathways, so it's a job-embedded clinical practice, they're serving as teacher of record, they have a clinical mentor, they've got a supervisor from the IHE also supporting them. They don't have to submit qualifying scores on that EdTPA or PLT until they're set to renew or advance their license, and that's because the training's happening during that 3-year period. So this is current policy. The proposal we brought before you in October really sought to just remove the requirement for job-embedded educators entirely, and that is recognizing the fact that they are serving as a teacher of record, they are evaluated by their administrators, and the expectations of that role are significant, and they're getting quite a bit of support while they're in that position. And the recommendation was to drop that beginning September 1st, 2023. I really should put my glasses on because when I get to these slides, I'm still not used to wearing them though. So feedback we've received thus far. So we've received quite a bit of feedback on this proposal. Majority of individuals that provided feedback are in support of eliminating the EdTPA for job-embedded candidates. That was an area that I think there was pretty much a good deal of support on that aspect of it. Many of those in support of the proposal recommended an earlier implementation date. And the reason for that is, as you remember, the requirement comes when somebody is set to renew or advance their license. Well, folks are arguing to bring that date back so that you can capture individuals who may not have been able to pass the EdTPA yet, but have a license set to expire this August. Also, some argued to expand the proposal to include undergraduate or other post-bac program completers. I think our position on that has been that those individuals aren't actually serving as teacher of record. It's a different type of clinical practice, and that the EdTPA is a valuable assessment and supports them through that. If this proposal is approved, there is a clear need to ensure communication to current educators, districts, and EPPs is clear. This is a big shift, and I think it's also one that we're proposing to go into effect pretty quickly. June is right around the corner. And I think the expectation would be that candidates applying right after June would qualify, and that they would be exempt from taking the EdTPA if you all approve the proposal.
But I guess that's where the confusion is. So students who are currently, I should say students, they're teachers who are currently job-embedded candidates that are taking EdTPA this semester. Mm-hmm. They would not have to continue in that course because of this June 1st date.
To clarify, they would not be required to submit the EdTPA for licensure purposes.
Correct. That's what I'm interpreting, because I know people, and I've spoken to the university in Cookeville, it's Tennessee Tech, that there are candidates who are currently enrolled in a course that they're offering, and their interpretation now is that those students could just stop taking the EdTPA course and not take the EdTPA exam.
I think that's a different question. I think that it's probably up to the institution as to how they want to constitute that course. I'd also say that EdTPA it's a strong assessment, and if a candidate or if an EPP wanted to retain the EdTPA, even if it weren't required for licensure, they could do so.
Right.
They do have that. I think a lot of EPPs have developed this seminar course that is really where candidates do the EdTPA, which maybe wasn't the intent early on, but that's kind of how it is now. And I think EPPs may need to kind of revisit those courses and think about how they can best use them if EdTPA is not a requirement.
And I've had that conversation with Tennessee Tech that you could continue to offer that course. Well, if you all are not going to require them, they're saying back to me, to take EdTPA, the exam, then we would stop offering this class, especially if those that are in that class right now this semester do not have to take the exam.
Yeah.
So why would we want to continue it? We want to comply with what the state board approves and not require them to take the class, because we only offer it to prepare them to take the test.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to get clarity, because even conversations you and I have had made me shift my mind on this and how I think it's supposed to work. And now I'm not so sure.
So I think the best way to put it is anyone who holds a license set to expire this August or later would qualify if the board passes this to be exempt from taking the EdTPA. The job embedded folks, let me just be really specific.
Right.
Meaning it doesn't really matter where they are in their program. Whether they're a first year student, they're in their first year of teaching, because their license isn't going to expire for another 3 years. Or they're in their second year, their license won't expire for another 2 years, or they're in their last year and their license will expire this year. None of them would be required to submit EdTPA under this proposal.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Eby.
So if I were a high school senior or even a freshman in college and thinking about going into teaching, and I looked at this and I said, well, I could go the traditional undergraduate pathway with student teaching, or I could go job embedded. Why would I choose the traditional way? Why wouldn't I just choose the job embedded, not have to worry about taking qualifying scores and actually get out there and start teaching?
Yeah. Should have said this earlier, but job embedded requires that you hold an undergraduate degree. It's a post-bac program.
That's to get started, right?
So
like
yep.
I say, I'm a high school senior. I'm thinking I want to be a teacher.
Yeah.
I may just go get a degree
Yep.
in math or something like
Mhm.
that and go in a job embedded program. How does that impact have the EPPs responded on what kind of impacts that they're going to have as a result of this?
A bit, yes. And it has been centered around the possibility that they could see some migration of folks toward job embedded programs out of traditional programs. I think that's probably okay. If these are people who meet the minimum criteria for content knowledge, and if we believe that a content major or the praxis exam show that, they're getting support from an EPP that has gone through a rigorous approval process that you all are oversee the expectations for it, then I think it's okay if they end up in the classroom in a job embedded setting. If there are positions for them to take and a district wants to hire them, then I think that's not a bad thing. Now, if somebody doesn't feel ready to do so, they will always have the option to do a traditional post-bac program.
Yes, Mr. Holt.
Michael, I was wondering if you're aware or anyone else is aware of whether there are any incentives for teachers to have the EdTPA qualification, aside from just that being a step into licensure. So if we remove that as a necessary element under certain pathways, but there are EPPs who are providing it, and we believe there is value in teachers going through that path, although maybe not one that we require in order for them to be licensed, is there some sort of intermediate step where we can incentivize, reward people doing it, but we don't say if you don't do it, you can't be a teacher anymore?
That's a really good question. And I don't know that we've talked about that yet, but I think it's one worth considering as we look ahead. Right now, no, there's not. Short answer.
And is that something that could occur at a district level? I just don't have enough of an understanding. Or is that something where, we would need to create some sort of system that provided for it? I mean, I'm thinking about districts have their own, I believe, their own compensation systems where they can provide different compensation for, you have a master's degree or a PhD or a number of years that you have been teaching, and one of them could be you have these sorts of credentials that maybe we used to require and now we don't, but we think are good and useful and we want to encourage. So just
that's a good point.
Putting that out there.
It could be a yes and too, by the way. We wanted to share some data that I think paints an interesting picture of EdTPA implementation for the different licensure pathways. So what this shows, it represents program completers and job embedded enrolled candidates from 2019-20, 2020-21, and 21-22. And job embedded candidates are actually having to retake the EdTPA at higher rates than student teaching or internship candidates. And there's a cost associated with that. I think that the rationale behind this data could be that they are really spending a whole lot of time juggling those responsibilities of their classroom and their preparation program, making EdTPA completion a little more onerous. And then when we look at outcomes, so when we look at average first year observation and average first year TVOS, and differentiating the two pathways, there really aren't many significant differences. It looks fairly similar.
Madam Chair? Just a quick question. What's your sample size? How much data are we actually looking at here?
Erica, do you know that? Erica helped with this immensely and very quickly.
Thank you. Erica Light, Director of Research for the State Board of Education. The sample size for undergraduate student teaching or the first row there, the traditional undergraduate or post-baccalaureate pathway. Sample size for that would be several thousand. The sample size for the job-embedded pathway is a few hundred.
And to clarify, are there any ways in which that data is dissected such that you end up with a less than acceptable sample size to apply this kind of analysis?
I would say that the sample size is large enough that we can make some inferences from it, but since it is several hundred people, but it is also a smaller percentage of the total job embedded candidates, since some of them, they take these exams at the end of their program and not at the beginning. So if we're observing them at the beginning of their program, we've not seen their exam score yet.
Okay. If I may, I'm going to take this opportunity to invite you, Eric, and maybe Michael as well, to speak to a question that we received. I know that other board members have looked at it, and I'm just going to read the question because I think there may be some misunderstanding that the board and that this team has not done an adequate analysis. And just based on your response to this last question, and of course knowing you and knowing how methodical you are, I know that you look through the lens of empirical data whenever we can. We can't always do that. But let me read this question/statement, and then if you could just respond. It says, just 1 year ago, we needed to have the highest EdTPA cut scores in the country. What changed in 12 months where we don't need EdTPA at all? Could the SBE not ask for data before deciding? JE, job embedded, has been around long enough to compare attrition rates, LOE scores, as well as simple demographic information as to the subject area in percent JE in an LEA. Looking at this information would help the SBE in setting policy in this area. So with that sort of question/comment, how would you respond so that the person who submitted this might better appreciate the analysis that has been conducted?
Do you have
Well, I would say, first of all, we still believe in EdTPA as being, in general, a useful assessment. We were looking in this specific case at job-embedded candidates because they are serving as teacher of record. They are having just a categorically different clinical practice experience than our traditional student teaching or internship candidates. And that is why we were looking at this group, singling out this group separate from other candidates. It's not intending to imply that the EdTPA is not a useful assessment.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this? I think I have one more slide. Okay, looking ahead, so you've heard a little bit of talk about kind of stepping back and looking at licensure on the whole, and really, one thing that came out of these recommendations and the feedback we received, it was pretty consistently said that we need consistency in our licensure system and clarity in our licensure system. And I think back to 2015, I was with the department back then, and we came to the board and proposed a massive shift in our licensure system because we had 11 or 12 different license types. And we were able to kind of pare that down to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 different license types. And I think we had a whole lot of clarity in that system when we did so. The board has also, and this is part of the reason why I enjoy working for the board, is because when you all have looked at licensure issues, you've really sought to maintain both rigor and expectations with an understanding that you need some flexibility, especially in a place where teacher shortages are a real issue for some regions. The The licensure system in Tennessee is complex, so legislation has resulted in the creation of new license types and pathways. The board has addressed that through rules. Communication about how you get a license in Tennessee has become increasingly challenging. I know that from my previous role. And especially as you have different out-of-state pathways and in-state pathways, it's now a good time to really kind of take a step back and spend some time looking at that system and determining, are there ways we can improve it and make it more streamlined and clear for the user. So we are actively developing a year-long plan to generate a clear picture of the current licensure structure, so a way that folks can kind of wrap their heads around and understand what exists now. Convene stakeholders to discuss strengths and weaknesses of that system, and develop proposals for improvement of this system to support coherence and clarity while supporting a clear vision for the purpose of professional educator licensure. So we're hoping to also look across the other states and identify best practices as we consider what we may want to change in Tennessee. And we hope to develop these proposals ahead of the next legislative session. I would be happy to take any other questions you may have.
Other questions, Mr. Eby?
Just a comment. It is confusing. And it's difficult to get your hand all around it. So I'm really happy to hear that we're going to take some time and look at the process and see how we can improve the process and make it clear. I got several comments, emails from various people across the state, asking questions similar to what Jordan read there. And so if we can make this process, improve this process, then I think we've made a lot of progress.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Eby. I don't think there are any other questions or comments. We're going to move on to the next item on the agenda. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Michael. I know it was complicated. It is complicated. The last item is the proposed licensure actions. Mr. Alex Anderson, Ms. Candace Carter, Mr. Todd Madison.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. I'm Todd Madison, staff attorney for the board, joined by Candace Carter and Alex Anderson, staff attorneys. We will have 3 agenda items for your consideration tomorrow. Items 5 and 6 will be our automatic actions as required by law and board rule. Item 7 will be our recommendations on licensure actions. Within that group, we have a note for item 7I. Mr. McGee has requested to speak at tomorrow's meeting, so he will need to be considered separately for discussion. With that, we can take any clarifying questions that you may have at this time, or note any additional items for separate discussion.
No questions, no comments. Thank you very much. We'll
Thank
see
you.
you tomorrow.
Madam Chair, do you have just a quick
Yes.
question or
Yes, Mr.
comment?
Mullenhour.
I was going to mention it tomorrow, but it sounds like tomorrow might be a packed agenda as today. My understanding is that one of your colleagues, Mr. Anderson, recently got commissioned. He's a commissioned first lieutenant in the Tennessee Air National Guard, recently appointed to Deputy Staff JAG, as I understand. So that's why he's not here today. Is that correct? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at him. Okay.
Here today, not tomorrow.
Great. Well, that's okay. Then I'm glad we brought it up. Then congratulations. Thank you for your work in that area and for wearing multiple hats and the work that you do here, and then also to of course serve the country. Well done.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention. Thank you all. Okay, so now we are moving into our final discussion. If there's anything else that any of the board members want to discuss before we adjourn, because we do want to get to our discussion with the Teacher Advisory Council. We are already cut short for that, unfortunately, but I want to find out anything else from board members.
I do
Yes,
have
Mr. Jensen.
one item. We talked to, I've got some real concerns about the chronic absenteeism truancy that we were really on top of it, it felt like, and then COVID came, and I'm just not clear where we are today and what we can do. There are, Memphis, I think, is at 30%, something in that range. feels good because Detroit's reporting like 59. So, but nonetheless, this is an issue I think that we. I'd like some sort of analysis of it, not, to understand where we are today, whether that's correct, if it's all urban, what does it look like across the state? I don't know if that information is available. I would think it would be, but I would appreciate some insight into the truancy, chronic absenteeism. I learned recently that you can't drop out till you're 17, but there are a lot of kids who drop out at 10, 11, 12 years old that not technically dropouts, but they're not going to school. And it would be helpful, I think, for us to take a look at that.
The data is being collected, and I believe it's by the department, so I see that Dr. Morrison is making notes, so we will make a request of the department to provide us with that info. Yes, Mr. Eby.
Real quickly, I would also like an assessment of how we're doing on the Tom Cronin Act now that the year is over for waivers on that. So I would like to know how the state is doing meeting that.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay. So let's go ahead and move into our adjournment. I do have to review the closing statement that I must make. The purposes of the committee of the whole have been fulfilled. Therefore, I declare it and the board adjourned. Thank you. Now, let me say this. Even though we're adjourned, I'm just going to give you the caveat. We have to be exiting from this building at 4:30. I know that that's beyond the time that you all had set aside. We were going to meet with you from 3 to 4. Are you able to stay longer to meet with us for about 30 minutes? Is that possible? You can? Okay. Because you've sat here all day, and we certainly appreciate you. But what we're going to do is we're going to move closer to you and try to move the chairs around so that we can have somewhat of a roundtable discussion, if you will. And we'll just be over there in a moment. Bear with us.